My name is Alice Carter, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in October last year along the remote banks of the Buffalo National River in North Arkansas, a trip that was meant to reconnect me with old friends and nature, but instead forced me to confront nightmares I never knew existed. I had always been the adventurous one, the leader who jumped at the chance to explore the wild. When my longtime friends Bob Martinez, Charlie Nguyen, and Diana Reed agreed to join me for a weekend getaway, I envisioned laughter around a roaring campfire and early morning hikes through sun-dappled trails. I'd even taken the liberty of booking an old RV that I thought would be our cozy retreat. In hindsight, I should have known better. We set off on a brisk October morning, the RV's engine sputtering and coughing as we made our way toward a secluded spot locals call Buffalo Bend. The name itself, evocative of untamed nature and hidden mysteries, sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off as mere coincidence. Bob, ever the skeptic, grumbled about the vehicle's age and the outdated equipment we'd been saddled with, unreliable heating, flickering lights, and a radio that picked up nothing but static. Yet, the promise of the wilderness was too alluring to turn back. The drive was filled with light banter. Charlie, with his endless jokes, tried to lift the mood, though his humor masked his own underlying anxiety about leaving civilization behind. Diana, quiet and introspective, kept mostly to herself, but I knew her well enough to understand that her silence was not indifference. It was her way of absorbing every detail of our surroundings, every rustle in the leaves, every whisper in the wind. By late afternoon, we arrived at Buffalo Bend. The river flowed with a lazy, deceptive calmness as we parked the RV on a narrow, graveled patch near the water's edge. Tall pines and gnarled oak trees bordered the area, their branches intertwining to form a natural archway, as if inviting us into their hidden realm. I remember feeling a sudden weight of history in that place, an ancient presence that was both beautiful and unsettling. That first night, after setting up a makeshift camp around the RV, the atmosphere began to shift. As darkness fell, Diana was the first to sense something was wrong. I was sitting outside sipping lukewarm coffee when she approached me with wide, frightened eyes. "Alice, did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It sounded like a child crying. I listened intently. In the distance, through the dense woods, there came a soft, mournful cry that echoed against the still night air. The sound was haunting, almost otherworldly, a lament that belonged to no living person. I tried to dismiss it as the wind playing tricks on our ears, but Diana's distress was unmistakable. Maybe it's just an animal or someone lost, I reasoned aloud, though a cold knot of unease was already forming in my stomach. Bob, who had been reviewing some old maps by the RV's dim light, frowned. "There's no way that was an animal. Animals don't cry like that. It's too human." Charlie chimed in with a quip meant to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's the ghost of a kid who lost his ice cream cone," he joked, but his laugh fell flat against the pervasive dread that was settling over us. The following morning, we set out to explore the area and shake off the eerie events of the previous night. However, while hiking along a narrow trail near the riverbank, Bob stopped abruptly. There, on a tree trunk, were strange symbols carved deep into the bark, primitive, almost ritualistic designs that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "Look at this," Bob said, his tone a mixture of fascination and discomfort. "These aren't random. They're markings. Maybe warnings?" Diana's eyes welled up with tears as she touched one of the carvings lightly. "These symbols, they're from indigenous lore. I've read about them. They're meant to appease ancient spirits, or perhaps to ward them off. But it feels like we've disturbed something that wasn't meant to be disturbed." I felt a chill, Not from the cool autumn air, but from the realization that our arrival at Buffalo Bend might have been a catalyst for awakening something buried deep in the forest's past. As dusk approached that evening, the RV's old generator struggled to keep our meager lights burning. The insufficient illumination only heightened our vulnerability. We gathered around a small campfire, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy, when the atmosphere grew oppressive. The temperature dropped rapidly, and an inexplicable mist began to roll in from the river, cloaking the campsite in a shroud of white. The mist seemed to have a life of its own, swirling and undulating as if guided by unseen hands. It was then that the radio, which had been nothing but static all day, suddenly resolved into a series of whispering voices. Faint, barely intelligible words floated through the speakers. Warnings, perhaps, or chants. The voices were layered, overlapping, as if multiple entities were speaking at once. I tried to turn the dial, but the static returned almost immediately, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Bob said, his eyes darting nervously between us. "I'm beginning to think there's more to these woods than just old trees and folklore." Charlie tried to inject some humor into the situation, but his voice was tight, and even his jokes couldn't mask the fear that had taken root in all of us. Diana sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the encroaching mist, her expression one of profound sadness and foreboding. As the night deepened, we heard it again. The sound of crying, this time louder and more anguished. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Something was out there, watching us from the darkness. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken by the occasional rustle of leaves, as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. Then came the confrontation. Around midnight, while I was lying in the cramped space of the RV, the door burst open with a force that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, only to see a shadowy figure in the doorway. It was hard to make out any details, a blur of darkness and motion, but I sensed a deep, malevolent presence emanating from it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. The figure did not answer, but instead slowly advanced into the light, revealing itself to be neither entirely human nor wholly spectral. Its features were distorted, as if viewed through a warped mirror. A face that might have been my own, but with eyes that burned with a cruel intelligence. I staggered back, barely catching the sound of a heavy thud as the entity brushed past me and vanished into the night. The RV erupted into chaos. Bob's voice cut through the panic as he argued that we needed to lock the doors and windows, to secure ourselves until morning. But Charlie, always the mediator, urged us to keep calm and think rationally. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," he insisted, though his hands trembled as he fiddled with the old flashlight. Diana, for her part, was already whispering prayers under her breath, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and empathy. "I feel it. I feel its pain," she murmured, as if trying to communicate with the entity. I realized then that this was no ordinary intruder. It was something born of the land's ancient past, a spirit tormented by centuries of injustice and sorrow. In the early hours of the morning, we huddled together in the RV, the oppressive atmosphere pressing in on us from all sides. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old vehicle, every rustle of the wind, seemed like a prelude to further horror. When the first weak rays of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, we cautiously emerged, our eyes red-rimmed and hearts heavy with dread. We decided to venture out and examine the area around the RV, hoping that daylight would dispel the lingering shadows. But as we stepped outside, we found that the mist had not lifted. Instead, it clung to the ground like a living thing, obscuring our vision and muffling the sounds of the forest. It was then that we stumbled upon a small clearing where more of the primitive symbols were etched into stone and wood. The symbols were arranged in a circular pattern, as if forming a ritualistic gateway. Someone, or something, has been performing rites here, Bob whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our collective fear. Diana knelt by one of the carvings, her fingers tracing the ancient lines. "This is a ritual of appeasement," she said softly. "I've read about similar rites in indigenous traditions. They were meant to honor spirits, to soothe their pain. But it looks like whoever performed this did so in desperation, as if the spirit was beyond their control." The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. We had unwittingly trespassed into a place of profound spiritual significance, a place where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were perilously thin. And now that ancient, vengeful spirit was awake, and it was angry. We gathered back at the RV, trying to piece together a plan. Charlie suggested we consult a local legend he'd overheard from a gas station attendant earlier that day. According to the story, the spirit was said to be the restless ghost of an indigenous shaman who had been betrayed and murdered by settlers centuries ago. His suffering had twisted into a curse, one that manifested as a spectral doppelganger, a mirror of his own despair and fury. The entity was known to appear as a distorted reflection of oneself, a harbinger of doom that intensified when its victims were divided by fear and suspicion. Despite our growing terror, we knew we couldn't simply hide until sunrise. The entity's power seemed to increase with our fear, feeding off our discord. With heavy hearts, we agreed that our only hope was to perform the ritual described in the fragmented note we had found near the carvings, a ritual meant to acknowledge the spirit's suffering and offer it peace. The note was cryptic, its instructions a blend of indigenous symbolism and desperate modern scribbles. It called for a small offering, a personal memento that held deep meaning, and a recitation of words meant to bridge the gap between our world and the spirits. Diana volunteered to lead the ceremony, her innate empathy and sensitivity making her the natural choice for such a delicate task. Before we began, we made sure to secure the RV as best we could, even though our equipment was failing us at every turn. Bob and Charlie worked together to reinforce the doors and windows, while I gathered the few items we had: Bob's old pocket watch, a cherished photo of our group in happier times, and a small worn teddy bear that Diana clutched like a talisman. That night, under a moon shrouded by lingering mist, we formed a circle near the clearing. The ancient symbols glowed faintly in the dim light, as if awakened by our presence. Diana began the incantation in a soft, trembling voice, her words merging with the rustle of the leaves and the distant, mournful cry of a spirit that seemed to echo our own sorrow. At first, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our pounding hearts. But then, as Diana's voice grew stronger, the air began to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. Shadows lengthened and twisted, coalescing into a shape that resembled the figure I had seen in the RV, distorted, familiar, and terrifying. For a moment, the entity hovered at the edge of our circle, its presence overwhelming and oppressive. It did not move to attack us directly, but the sheer force of its gaze was enough to freeze our blood. Bob's skepticism melted away in that moment, replaced by raw, unfiltered terror. Charlie's jokes died on his lips, his face pale as he stared into the abyss of our collective nightmare. In that suspended moment, I felt as though the spirit was reaching out to us, not to harm, but to be understood. I stepped forward, my voice quivering as I spoke directly to the entity. "We know your pain. We know you've been wronged. Please, let us help you find peace." The entity's form wavered, and for an eternity that felt like mere seconds, I sensed a profound sorrow emanating from it, a sorrow that transcended time and echoed the pain of a people long forgotten. Then, as if in answer, the mist swirled violently around us, and the symbols on the stones pulsed with an ethereal light. But peace was not to come without sacrifice. In the chaos that followed, as the ritual reached its fevered climax, a violent gust of wind knocked Bob off his feet. He tumbled against a protruding rock, his cry of pain lost amid the howling wind. In the ensuing turmoil, the entity's presence became more aggressive. Objects flew through the air, and the oppressive force of the supernatural nearly overwhelmed us. I scrambled to support Bob, whose injuries were serious, while Diana and Charlie desperately tried to continue the incantation to calm the malevolent force. It was then that I realized the terrible truth. The spirit, in its anguish, was not simply a passive observer. It was an active force of nature, dangerous and unpredictable. The entity did not want to harm us out of malice, but its suffering had warped into a power that could not be easily controlled. It was both a guardian of its ancient legacy and a harbinger of death. As the first light of dawn broke through the mist, the wind subsided, and the spectral figure began to recede. Our ritual had, if only temporarily, pacified the spirit. Bob was stabilized by Charlie's quick thinking and the few first aid supplies we had salvaged, though his recovery would be long and uncertain. The clearing was silent once again. The only evidence of the night's terror, the lingering glow of the ancient symbols etched into the rocks. In the aftermath, we huddled together, shaken and forever changed. The entity had not been vanquished. It simply retreated into the depths of its own sorrow, leaving us with a stark reminder of the consequences of trespassing into realms where ancient curses still hold sway. The group's dynamics were irrevocably altered. Bob's skepticism had been shattered by the undeniable presence of the supernatural. Charlie's humor had given way to a somber realism, and Diana, though still the sensitive empath, now carried the heavy burden of having communed with a tortured soul. We left Buffalo Bend that day with a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The RV, our shelter against the darkness, seemed even more fragile in its inadequacy, a symbol of our vulnerability in the face of forces far beyond our control. I often find myself haunted by the memory of that night, the oppressive mist, the ghostly figure, and the sound of Diana's voice as she pleaded for peace on behalf of a spirit trapped in endless torment. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had been irreversibly intertwined with the ancient lore of these woods. I spent long, sleepless nights poring over local legends and historical accounts, trying to piece together the identity of the vengeful spirit. I learned that the shaman whose sorrow had manifested in our encounter was one of many who had suffered at the hands of settlers, his legacy preserved only in whispered tales and forbidden rituals. His pain was not unique. It was a collective grief that spanned generations, a reminder that the land itself bore the scars of human cruelty and neglect. Bob eventually recovered, though his once steadfast rationality was forever eroded by his experiences. He now carried a small talisman, a token from our ritual, as a reminder that some mysteries are beyond the reach of logic. Charlie, who had always been the mediator, found his humor tinged with a subtle melancholy, as if he had seen too much of the darkness that lurked beneath the veneer of everyday life. And Diana, she retreated further into herself, her sensitivity now a double-edged sword that allowed her to perceive not only beauty and hope, but also the unspeakable agony of the past. As for me, I returned to my daily life, but the wilderness of Buffalo Bend continues to call to me in dreams and half-remembered visions. I sometimes wonder if our intrusion had awakened something that still lingers among the ancient pines and moss-covered stones. The experience taught me that the boundaries between our world and that of the spirits are perilously thin, that the past is never truly dead, and that nature, wild and ancient, demands respect. In the quiet moments, when the wind carries a faint, sorrowful cry, I think back to that night and the terrible beauty of a spirit desperate for release. I have come to accept that some encounters are meant to leave their mark, a permanent scar on the soul. And though I no longer seek out the darkness, I know that I will never be free from its memory. Buffalo Bend remains etched in my mind as a place of haunting beauty and tragic sorrow, a reminder that even in the most remote corners of the world, the past is never truly at rest. My experience there changed me, taught me to look beyond the veil of the everyday, and to acknowledge that the legends of old still whisper in the winds of North Arkansas. And so I carry on, forever marked by the spirit of that ancient shaman, and forever vigilant against the encroaching shadows of a world that is far more mysterious and dangerous than we can ever fully comprehend. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in November of last year, when I decided to drive my aging RV into the depths of Devil's Hollow, a secluded clearing near Harrison, Arkansas. I was running from a past that I could no longer bear, a past filled with regret and guilt. And I hoped that the isolation of the wilderness might finally give me the clarity I so desperately needed. I had spent months planning this solo retreat, meticulously plotting a route away from the chaos of my former life. The RV, a clunky relic of my youth with a temperamental engine and flickering interior lights, was both my sanctuary and my prison. Its unreliable battery and malfunctioning radio only added to the sense of impending doom that seemed to echo my inner turmoil. The drive was long and lonesome. The roads twisted through dense forests and over rocky terrain until I reached the outskirts of Devil's Hollow. The area was infamous among locals for its eerie silence and strange legends. I'd heard whispered tales of a secretive cult that once roamed these woods, performing bizarre rituals to purge guilt and control fate. I dismissed those stories as mere folklore until I saw the place for myself. Upon arrival, the first thing that struck me was the oppressive stillness. I parked the RV on a narrow patch of gravel beneath ancient oak trees, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like desperate hands. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a night bird. As I stepped out, a chill ran through me. Not from the cold November air, but from the palpable weight of history that seemed to hang over Devil's Hollow. My initial sense of unease was compounded when I discovered a cryptic note taped to the RV's door. The note, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting, read, "You are not alone. The past watches. Beware the hollow." I couldn't shake the feeling that this message was meant for me. Had someone left it intentionally? Or was it a warning from forces beyond my understanding? That night, the RV's unreliable systems betrayed me. The lights flickered as the engine sputtered intermittently, leaving me in darkness more often than not. I tried to fix the radio, but all I received was an endless stream of static that made my skin crawl. Alone in the dark, I began to experience something I hadn't anticipated. Flashbacks of my past. Images of mistakes made, loved ones lost, and the overwhelming guilt that I had carried for years invaded my thoughts, blurring the line between memory and nightmare. I attempted to calm myself with a cup of lukewarm coffee, its bitter taste a small comfort. As I sat on a creaking chair near the window, I heard a sound, a subtle scraping on the side of the RV. My heart pounded as I peered into the murky darkness. At first, I assumed it was the wind, But then I noticed strange scratches along the side of the vehicle, as if something had been trying to claw its way in. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch the marks, and the sensation of cold, wet metal sent a shiver through me. It was then that I knew I was not entirely alone. The next day, determined to understand the source of my mounting paranoia, I set out to explore the area around Devil's Hollow. The morning fog clung to the ground, softening the edges of the landscape and lending an ethereal quality to everything it touched. As I walked along a narrow path, I stumbled upon a series of cryptic graffiti markings on a large boulder. The symbols were primitive, resembling those I had seen in books about local indigenous lore. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a ritualistic gateway or a map meant to lead to something hidden. I knelt down to examine the symbols more closely. My fingers traced the etched lines, and I could almost feel the energy of the past pulsing through the stone. I recalled the legends of an ancient cult that had once inhabited these woods. People who believed that, by performing forbidden rites, they could exorcise the demons of their past. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Had their rituals left an imprint on the land itself? I continued my exploration, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The solitude of the hollow was beginning to exacerbate my inner demons. Memories of the tragedy that had shattered my life, moments of anger, despair, and regret, swirled in my mind like restless phantoms. Each step I took seemed to echo with the voices of those I had lost, and every rustle of the leaves felt like a whisper of condemnation. While gathering firewood near a cluster of weathered pines, I encountered a man who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. His clothes were tattered, his face lined with the wisdom of a life spent wandering, and his eyes held a glimmer of something ancient and knowing. He introduced himself simply as Old Tom. "Mind if I join you, son?" he asked, in a gravelly voice that carried the weight of untold stories. I hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger, but his presence was oddly comforting, a living link to the local lore that I had been trying to dismiss. Over a small crackling fire, Old Tom regaled me with tales of Devil's Hollow. He spoke of a cult that had once sought to rid themselves of guilt through twisted rituals, sacrificing parts of their souls in the process. According to him, the cult's practices left behind an energy, a residue of sorrow and rage that had never fully dissipated. "You see, Marcus," Old Tom said, his eyes narrowing as he looked into the flickering flames. "This place isn't just about ghosts and shadows. It's about the weight of history, the sins of those who came before us. And sometimes that history comes back to remind us that some things are best left alone." His words resonated with me, echoing the turmoil that had long been locked away in my heart. As the night deepened, Old Tom vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving me with more questions than answers. His warnings, however, left an indelible mark on my consciousness. Returning to the RV, I found more signs that I was being watched. Abandoned personal items lay scattered near the trail. A child's toy, a weathered scarf, even an old, rusted locket. Each item was placed with unsettling precision, as if by someone who intended to send a message. The mounting evidence made it clear that someone, or something, was toying with me, perhaps using the relics of the past to lure me deeper into the hollow. That evening, as a storm began to roll in, the RV's interior became a claustrophobic labyrinth of shadows and flickering light. The tempest outside was a perfect match for the turmoil within. Rain pounded the roof, and thunder rumbled in the distance, setting my nerves on edge. I attempted to review the journal I had found earlier, a tattered, leather-bound notebook filled with frantic scribbles and faded photographs of unknown faces. The journal hinted at secret rituals and desperate attempts to rid oneself of inner torment. Its pages were filled with symbols similar to those etched on the boulder, and it spoke of an offering, a personal memento imbued with deep meaning that could somehow bridge the gap between the living and the dead. As the storm raged on, I began to hear strange noises again, soft footsteps outside the RV, whispers that seemed to seep through the walls, and the persistent scraping that made my skin crawl. I locked every door and window, but the feeling of being trapped only intensified my isolation. In the midst of the chaos, I saw a shadow flicker in the corner of my vision, a figure that appeared to be watching, waiting. It was too fleeting to be real, yet too persistent to dismiss as a trick of the light. I resolved that I could no longer ignore the signs. With a deep breath, I gathered my courage and decided to follow the trail of cryptic symbols and abandoned items. I retraced my steps along the winding path, the rain soaking through my clothes and blurring my vision. Each step was a struggle against both the physical elements and the mounting psychological strain. I couldn't help but wonder if the trail was leading me to a confrontation with the remnants of the cult old Tom had mentioned, or if it was simply a manifestation of my own tortured mind. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the line between reality and hallucination began to blur. My mind was plagued by flashes of memories, the faces of those I had lost, moments of regret and despair, and I found it increasingly difficult to tell whether these were echoes of my past or the work of the unseen forces that haunted Devil's Hollow. Then, in a small clearing illuminated by intermittent lightning, I saw him. The mysterious figure stood at the center, half hidden by the swirling mist. He was draped in a dark, tattered cloak, his face obscured by shadows. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with an energy that was both menacing and sorrowful. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. The figure's voice was soft, yet it carried an authority that sent shivers down my spine. "I am the keeper of forgotten sins, the one who bears witness to the guilt of those who cannot forgive themselves," he said. His words resonated with a terrible familiarity, as if he were speaking directly to the darkest corners of my soul. In that moment, I felt as though the figure was a mirror reflecting my own inner demons. His presence forced me to confront the unresolved guilt that had driven me into exile. The weight of my past bore down on me with overwhelming force, and I realized that the journey into Devil's Hollow was not just an escape from my history, but a confrontation with it. With the storm intensifying around us, the mysterious figure stepped forward, and I was forced to choose. Continue running from the truth of my own guilt, or face the painful memories that had haunted me for so long. The RV, my supposed refuge, seemed a distant memory as I stood alone in that clearing, vulnerable and exposed to forces beyond my control. The confrontation was both external and internal. The figure's eyes, now visible in the flash of lightning, were deep wells of sorrow and rage, a living embodiment of the collective anguish of those who had suffered under the weight of their own sins. His presence was a catalyst, forcing me to relive the moments I had long tried to forget. The loss of a loved one, the mistakes that had cost me dearly, and the unbearable guilt that had driven me into this self-imposed exile. In a moment of clarity amid the chaos, I remembered the instructions in the tattered journal. There was supposed to be an offering, a personal memento that held the essence of one's guilt and regret. With trembling hands, I reached into my RV for the small silver locket that had belonged to my late sister, a reminder of both the love we once shared and the tragic events that had torn us apart. I returned to the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest, and held the locket aloft as I recited the words I barely understood. the incantation, a desperate plea for absolution, mingled with the fury of the storm and the howls of the wind. For a moment, time seemed to suspend. The figure's expression softened, and I sensed a profound sadness emanating from him, a sadness that mirrored my own. It was as if, in that instant, the figure and I were two sides of the same coin, bound together by the weight of our sins. The wind died down, and the mist around us began to dissipate, revealing the ancient symbols etched into the surrounding trees, glowing faintly as if in response to the ritual. But the moment of reprieve was short-lived. The silence was shattered by a sudden, violent gust of wind that knocked me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the locket slipping from my grasp. In the ensuing chaos, the mysterious figure reappeared, his form now indistinct and shifting like smoke. His voice, once soft and measured, turned harsh and accusatory. "You cannot escape what you have done," he intoned. "You must face your guilt, or be consumed by it." The words struck me like a physical blow. Tears streamed down my face as I scrambled to rise, the locket clutched tightly in my shaking hand. The figure's presence, which had once seemed almost compassionate, now filled me with a terror that I had never known. I realized that the ritual was not meant to banish the guilt, but to force me to confront it head-on. A trial by fire in which only the truly repentant could survive. The storm continued to rage around me, the relentless rain and thunder echoing the tumult in my heart. I felt exposed, as if the very fabric of my soul were being unraveled by the forces of nature and fate. The mysterious figure circled me, his eyes boring into mine, demanding that I acknowledge the full extent of my wrongdoing. Every step, every breath became a struggle against the overwhelming pressure of my own conscience. In that moment, I made a choice. I chose not to run, not to hide behind the crumbling walls of my past, but to confront the truth of what I had done. With a voice that trembled but grew stronger with each word, I began to confess, admitting my mistakes, accepting the sorrow, and begging for forgiveness from a past that could never be rewritten. My confession was raw, unfiltered, and painful, each syllable a step toward absolution. As I spoke, the mysterious figure began to fade into the background, his form dissolving into the dissipating mist. The storm gradually lost its ferocity, and the oppressive atmosphere of Devil's Hollow began to lift, leaving behind a silence that was both eerie and oddly peaceful. I stood there alone in the clearing, soaked to the bone, heart aching with the weight of my confession, yet feeling a glimmer of relief as though a burden had been lifted. I returned to the RV in the early hours of dawn, the remnants of the storm still echoing in the distance. The vehicle, with its faulty systems and creaking frame, felt almost symbolic of my own frailty. But as I sat there in the dim light of a struggling battery, I realized that the true test of survival was not in escaping the supernatural forces of Devil's Hollow, but in confronting the darkness that lay within me. In the days that followed, I remained at Devil's Hollow, not out of fear of the supernatural, but to reconcile the fragmented pieces of my past with the possibility of redemption. I spent long hours poring over the journal and the symbols etched into the trees, seeking to understand the legacy of the cult and the tragic history that had left its mark on these woods. Each discovery deepened my understanding of the human need to atone for past sins and the harsh reality that some wounds never fully heal. I never saw old Tom again, nor did the mysterious figure return. Yet the echoes of that night lingered with me. The RV, battered by the storm and the passage of time, became a moving monument to a journey that had forced me to face my own demons. The silver locket, now a cherished memento of both loss and hope, remained with me as a constant reminder that redemption, however painful, was possible, even in the heart of a forsaken hollow. My time in Devil's Hollow reshaped me in ways I am still coming to understand. The isolation, the storms, the cryptic messages, and the spectral figures all served to strip away the layers of pretense that I had built around myself. I learned that some battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the haunting regrets that can imprison a soul. In facing my guilt head-on, I discovered that true freedom lies in accepting the past, even when that past is a tapestry of sorrow and regret. Now, as I drive my old RV along the winding roads of North Arkansas, I am no longer the man who fled in terror from his own mistakes. I carry the scars of Devil's Hollow with me, but they no longer define me. Instead, they serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is a chance for redemption. The journey is never easy, and the ghosts of our past may always linger at the edges of our vision, but it is in confronting them that we find our true strength. Devil's Hollow taught me that isolation can be both a curse and a blessing. It forced me to confront the deepest, most painful parts of my soul, and in doing so, paved the way for a fragile hope of healing. As I continue on this uncertain path, I hold on to the belief that the human spirit, no matter how burdened by guilt, has the capacity to overcome even the most relentless of shadows. And so, my journey goes on, marked by the memory of a stormy night, a mysterious figure who mirrored my inner torment, and a place where the past still whispers its secrets. I have learned that sometimes the greatest horror we face is not in the supernatural, but in the unyielding truth of our own hearts. My name is Grace. I am 34 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023, on a lonely stretch of Devil's Backbone Road in the Ozarks of North Arkansas, a place where the isolation of nature hides dark secrets and ancient grudges. I had always been cautious by nature, a planner with a penchant for details and an insatiable curiosity about local folklore. When Nathan, my partner, adventurous, headstrong, and prone to dismissing anything that couldn't be explained with logic, proposed a romantic escape in our old RV, I hesitated only briefly. I knew the RV was temperamental, its creaks and groans as familiar as old friends complaining about their aches. Yet, the promise of quiet solitude and scenic vistas was irresistible. We set out on a cool October morning, the sky a crisp blue, the air redolent with the scent of fallen leaves. Our destination was Devil's Backbone Road, a secluded, winding path notorious among locals not only for its breathtaking views, but also for the eerie legends that clung to its curves. The locals spoke of a vengeful spirit, a sorrowful apparition born of indigenous tragedy and settler guilt that roamed the area under the cloak of night. The RV itself was a relic. Its dashboard flickered intermittently as if struggling to hold on to life, and the heater sputtered unpredictably. I double-checked our supplies, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my journal, in which I meticulously recorded every detail of our journey. Nathan, on the other hand, reveled in the adventure, his eyes alight with the thrill of the unknown. "We're making memories," he said with a roguish grin, brushing off my concerns about our aging equipment. That first night, as dusk crept over the landscape, we parked in a clearing along the backbone. I could feel an undercurrent of unease, a silent warning that the beauty of the land concealed something darker. The RV's interior lights flickered, casting long wavering shadows along the walls, and the radio, an old transistor set, began to emit strange static that seemed almost like distant voices speaking in a language I faintly recognized from my readings on local Native American legends. It was around midnight when things began to truly unravel. I awoke to a sudden blackout. The RV's lights died, plunging us into thick, oppressive darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and noticed the radio now murmuring in distorted tones, as if reciting an incantation. Nathan, ever the skeptic, laughed it off at first, blaming it on faulty wiring. But as I listened more intently, a chill crawled up my spine. The static wasn't random. It was patterned, rhythmic, almost like a warning. Stepping outside to inspect the exterior, I was met with an otherworldly sight. A dense, unnatural fog had rolled in, enveloping the clearing in a milky haze that blurred the familiar outlines of trees and rocks. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the RV settling on the cold ground. And then I saw her, a spectral figure drifting near the ridge. She was clad in a tattered white dress, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes empty yet accusing. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze as I locked gazes with the apparition, feeling as though she were trying to communicate a dire warning. Nathan soon joined me, though he insisted that it was nothing more than a trick of the fog and poor lighting. His rationality clashed with my mounting dread, and in that moment, the tension between us grew palpable. I pleaded with him to take the situation seriously, but he dismissed my fears, attributing them to the stress of the trip and the quirks of old machinery. Over the next few days, the eerie occurrences escalated. Our RV began to malfunction more frequently. Electrical failures at the worst possible moments. A heater that only worked when it was unbearably cold, and the radio, which continued to broadcast ghostly voices. I spent hours scouring local legends and old newspaper clippings in the RV's cramped library, piecing together the history of Devil's Backbone. I learned that the area was once a battleground of cultural clashes, and that a tragic incident involving the displacement of indigenous people had left behind a curse. The restless spirit we had encountered might be the embodiment of that sorrow, a vengeful remnant of lives lost and injustices committed. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a moonless night, the sky a canvas of impenetrable black. Nathan and I had barely slept. The tension between us was as thick as the fog that now seemed permanently draped over our campsite. I sat by the flickering campfire, writing feverishly in my journal, while Nathan dozed off on a makeshift bed in the RV. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the silence, a metallic clang followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. I bolted to the RV, flashlight trembling in my hand, and found the door ajar. My heart pounded as I peered into the darkness beyond. In the distance, through the swirling fog, I saw movement, a figure, tall and distorted, gliding silently toward us. The figure, a hulking silhouette with elongated limbs and a face obscured by shadow, seemed to be both human and something else entirely. It was as if the creature was caught between worlds, its form unstable and shifting. I recognized the legend of the Wendigo, a being born of cannibalistic hunger and isolation. But this presence carried an air of ancient malice, a warning that the land itself was alive with anger. My scream must have startled Nathan awake. He bolted out of the RV, and together we watched in terror as the creature paused at the edge of the clearing, as if sizing us up. It did not immediately attack, but its presence was suffocating, oppressive. We retreated inside the RV, bolting the door and huddling together as the night seemed to close in around us. In the following hours, the supernatural assaults continued. Objects in the RV began to move on their own. A pot sliding across the counter. A map fluttering open to reveal cryptic symbols that matched the markings I had seen carved into trees along Devil's Backbone. Nathan's dismissive attitude began to crumble under the relentless barrage of inexplicable events, and for the first time, his bravado gave way to raw, unfiltered fear. Desperate for answers, I decided that we needed help, someone who understood these legends and could guide us through this terror. The next day, amidst our strained silence and mutual apprehension, I recalled a reclusive local I had read about in one of the old clippings. His name was Henry, an eccentric hermit who had lived on the outskirts of the backbone for decades. According to local lore, Henry was a keeper of forgotten rites and ancient rituals, the one person who might know how to appease the vengeful spirit that haunted the area. We managed to contact Henry using an old payphone at a dilapidated service station. His voice was raspy and laden with skepticism when he learned of our plight, but he agreed to meet us that evening at a small clearing near the edge of the woods. Reluctantly, we made the journey, the RV's engine groaning in protest along the rough, winding road. Henry arrived clad in worn, earth-toned clothing, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see right through us. He carried with him a small leather bag containing what he called tokens of the past, a hand-carved talisman, a faded piece of parchment with ancient symbols, and a small container of what he claimed was sacred water blessed by indigenous shamans. In a gravelly voice, he explained that the spirit we had disturbed was not merely a ghost, but a vengeful entity born of sorrow and injustice. The apparition in the white dress, the strange radio static, and the eerie fog were all manifestations of its anguish, a curse that had been passed down through generations. Henry told us of a ritual, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to appease the spirit and put it to rest. The ritual required us to offer a symbolic representation of the land's original inhabitants, a token that would acknowledge the pain inflicted upon them. It also required reciting an incantation in the ancient tongue, a language lost to time but preserved in the echoes of local legend. I was skeptical, but as the night deepened and the supernatural disturbances grew bolder, I found myself clinging to Henry's words like a lifeline. That night, under a sky devoid of moonlight, we returned to our campsite. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of the leaves sent shivers down my spine. With trembling hands, I retrieved the talisman from Henry's bag, a small, intricately carved stone that bore the likeness of a native spirit. Nathan, now visibly shaken and desperate, helped me set up the makeshift altar on a flat rock at the edge of the clearing. Henry instructed us to arrange the talisman, the sacred water, and the parchment in a specific formation. I recited the incantation as best as I could, stumbling over the archaic words that felt both foreign and hauntingly familiar. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to echo the incantation back at me, as though the very land was speaking. For a moment, the air vibrated with a palpable energy, a silent promise of retribution or redemption. Then, as if in response, the fog thickened, and the spectral figure in the white dress reappeared. This time, however, her eyes held not sorrow, but fury. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and the creature from the night before, the monstrous, shifting figure, rejoined the scene, its presence now overtly hostile. It circled our makeshift altar, its movements erratic and predatory, as if testing the boundaries of our ritual. I felt a surge of panic as objects around us began to levitate, a rock thrown into the air by an unseen force, the talisman vibrating in my hand, the sacred water rippling as though stirred by invisible fingers. Nathan's face was etched with terror. His earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of this raw, supernatural violence. The confrontation reached its climax when a violent gust of wind ripped through the clearing, scattering our carefully arranged items. The spirit in the white dress advanced, her features twisting into an expression of rage and despair, and the monstrous Wendigo-like figure let out a guttural, bone-chilling roar. I struggled to steady myself, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst free from my chest. In that moment, every story of cursed lands and vengeful spirits that I had ever read leaped to life before my eyes. I clutched Nathan's hand, and together we made a desperate, unspoken decision. We had to survive, to somehow break free from the grip of this malevolent force. In a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the talisman, and with the few coherent words of the incantation still on my tongue, I charged toward the spirit. The force of my determination seemed to create a ripple through the chaos, and for a split second the surrounding entities paused, as if caught in the balance between two opposing forces. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died down. The fog dissipated like smoke, and the supernatural figures receded into the darkness. The clearing fell into an eerie silence, broken only by our ragged breaths and the distant sound of the RV's engine struggling to restart. It was as if the land had momentarily exhaled, releasing its pent-up anger. In the aftermath, Nathan and I sat huddled together, our bodies trembling with shock and our minds reeling from the night's terror. The ritual, as far as I could tell, had not banished the spirit entirely. It had merely subdued its immediate fury. Henry's words echoed in my ears. Some curses are not so easily laid to rest, and the land's sorrow can never be entirely forgotten. Over the following days, our ordeal continued to haunt us. The RV's malfunctions became more frequent, and the radio occasionally crackled to life with faint, desperate whispers in that ancient tongue. Nathan's once unshakable optimism had been replaced by a cautious dread. We were no longer on a romantic getaway, but trapped in a nightmare where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural blurred. I documented every detail in my journal, recording our every move, every whispered warning from the wind, and every fleeting glimpse of the spectral figure. I scoured old records and local accounts, desperate to find a clue that might help us truly appease the restless spirit. I learned that the entity might not be a single force but a composite of multiple tragedies, an amalgamation of sorrow, anger, and grief born from a history of exploitation and loss. It was not just the ghost in the white dress or the monstrous Wendigo-like creature. It was the collective pain of a land scarred by injustice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of crimson and indigo, Nathan and I finally decided that we could not continue to live in constant fear. We needed to confront the truth of what had happened and find a way to reclaim our lives. With heavy hearts and a sense of grim determination, we packed up our few remaining belongings, said a silent farewell to the haunted clearing of Devil's Backbone, and began our journey back to civilization. The drive back was long and silent, each mile measured by the steady beat of our heartbeats and the relentless hum of the RV's engine. I kept reading passages from my journal, trying to make sense of the horror we had endured, while Nathan sat in quiet reflection, the weight of his earlier dismissals now a bitter regret. Looking back, I realized that our encounter on Devil's Backbone was not just a brush with a supernatural force. It was a confrontation with our own vulnerabilities. The tensions between us, the failures of our equipment, and the inexplicable horrors that stalked us in the darkness were all intertwined. They forced us to face the reality that sometimes the past, with all its pain and injustice, never truly dies. It lingers in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to resurface in moments of weakness and isolation. Today, as I write these words from a small, sunlit room far from the cursed roads of North Arkansas, I can still hear the echoes of that night. The ragged breathing in the darkness, the whispered warnings carried by the wind, and the mournful gaze of the spirit in the white dress. I have come to understand that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but simply endured, a part of the tapestry of our lives that reminds us of the thin line between our world and the unknown. I continue to wonder whether, In our desperate attempt to appease an ancient sorrow, we inadvertently set something in motion that can never be entirely undone. But even as the memories of that fateful trip haunt my dreams, I have learned that survival sometimes means accepting the unsolvable, living with the questions, and moving forward despite the darkness that lurks in the corners of the world. That journey on Devil's Backbone changed me in ways I am still coming to terms with. I no longer view the isolation of nature as a peaceful refuge, but as a realm where the past can rise with a vengeance, where the land itself remembers every injustice and every loss. And while Nathan and I have since attempted to rebuild our lives, the shadow of that night remains. A constant reminder that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are not those we can see or touch, but the unresolved grief of a history that refuses to be forgotten. In the end, our tale is one of survival against the odds, a struggle against an ancient, malevolent force that defied explanation. It is a story of two souls brought together by love and torn apart by terror, a testament to the fragility of human existence when faced with the enduring wrath of the past. And as I continue to write, I know that I must never forget the lessons of Devil's Backbone, that in every shadow lies a memory, and in every whispered legend, a truth waiting to be acknowledged. This is my story, a story of fear, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness. My name is Jacob, and I am 42 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023, when I decided to escape the chaos of life and seek solace in the quiet depths of the Ouachita National Forest near Mount Ida, Arkansas. I had been grappling with the weight of personal loss, a grief that had left me feeling hollow and in desperate need of time alone to mend the fractures of my heart. Renting an old RV for a solitary camping trip seemed like the perfect remedy, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, surrounded by nature's ancient silence. The RV itself was a relic from another era, its once bright paint now faded by years of exposure to sun and rain. Mechanical gremlins were a constant companion. The engine sputtered unpredictably, the heater coughed up feeble warmth, and the electrical system flickered as if it were on the brink of collapse. I knew these faults were part of the charm, and perhaps even a portent of what was to come, but I pressed on, eager to find solace. I parked the RV near a secluded bend along Forgotten Creek, a small, almost forgotten waterway that wound its way through the dense forest. Locals rarely visited this part of the Ouachitas. The area was shrouded in whispered legends of sorrow and mystery. It was said that long ago the creek had been the site of a tragic event, an indigenous massacre and subsequent disappearance of a young local whose spirit had never found rest. Though I was skeptical of such stories, the lingering air of melancholy in the forest resonated with my own internal pain. The first day was deceptively ordinary. I spent the morning unpacking, setting up a small camp near the creek, and exploring the immediate surroundings. As I walked along a narrow path, my eyes caught sight of something unusual on the bark of a massive oak tree. A series of carvings, deep and deliberate. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before, their curves and angles reminiscent of Native American pictographs. I traced them with my fingertips, feeling an inexplicable connection, as if the tree itself was trying to communicate its ancient history and grief. That evening, as twilight settled over the forest, I sat by a crackling campfire, lost in thought and the soft murmur of the creek. The isolation that I had sought so desperately now began to feel profound. But as darkness deepened, subtle signs of eeriness began to unfold. I first noticed a low, persistent hum, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath my feet. It was as if the forest was chanting in a language older than time, a lament that echoed off the trunks of the trees. I tried to ignore it, attributing the sound to the nocturnal calls of distant animals. Yet, as the hum persisted, it took on a more haunting quality, a mournful melody that tugged at the edges of my consciousness. Later that night, when I returned to my RV, I discovered that some personal notes I had jotted down in my journal were inexplicably scattered across the floor. They contained fragments of a story about a long-ago disappearance, a case that had puzzled local residents for decades. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection between those legends and the eerie carvings I'd seen earlier. The RV's creaks and groans, which had seemed almost comforting in the daylight, now became a backdrop to my rising anxiety. In the silence of the night, every sound was amplified. I began to feel that I was not entirely alone, that something unseen was watching from the shadows. On the second night, unable to shake my mounting unease, I decided to follow the sound of the hum. Armed with only a flashlight and my journal, I stepped away from the RV and made my way toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The path wound its way alongside Forgotten Creek, and as I advanced, the temperature dropped noticeably. A chill seeped into my bones, and the once familiar rustling of leaves took on a whispering quality. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through dense underbrush, I stumbled upon an old clearing. In its center stood what appeared to be an indigenous shrine, an arrangement of stones, weathered artifacts, and carefully arranged offerings. The shrine was overgrown with moss, yet it exuded a profound sense of reverence and sorrow. There, in the dim light of my flashlight, I saw her. A spectral figure, delicate and sorrowful, stood near the shrine. She was dressed in traditional indigenous garb, her long, dark hair cascading around her shoulders, and her eyes were filled with an ineffable grief. I froze, my heart pounding, as her gaze met mine. There was no malice in her eyes, only a silent plea for remembrance and justice. In that moment, I felt a deep, aching connection to her sorrow, as if her loss mirrored my own. I managed to whisper a tentative greeting, but the apparition did not speak. Instead, she drifted closer, her form growing more translucent with each step, until she was standing directly before me. I felt as though I were caught in a fragile balance between the living and the dead, between memory and myth. The encounter was both terrifying and profoundly moving, and I realized that this spirit was not here to harm me, but to remind me of the deep wounds that time had left on this land. Returning to my RV with a mind reeling from the encounter, I could not shake the feeling that the forest was alive with memories of a tragedy long past. Over the following days, the presence of the spectral woman lingered. At odd intervals, I would find fresh carvings on nearby trees, new symbols that seemed to build upon the ones I'd seen on the oak. The persistent hum continued, and every so often, the breeze would carry soft, indistinct whispers that felt like prayers or laments. Yet, the unease was not confined to supernatural manifestations alone. The old RV began to break down in earnest. Mechanical failures became more frequent, with the engine stuttering unexpectedly and the heater failing just as the nights grew colder. Each malfunction left me stranded for hours at a time, forced to make repairs under the relentless gaze of a forest that no longer felt entirely benign. During one particularly trying evening, while I was attempting to coax the engine back to life after another breakdown, I noticed something even more disconcerting. Scattered around my campsite were fragments of paper, yellowed, brittle pages containing cryptic notes about the disappearance of a young local from decades past. The notes were written in a hurried, almost desperate hand, and they recounted a story of betrayal, loss, and a curse that had fallen upon the land. I gathered the pages with trembling fingers, each word intensifying the mystery and the sorrow that hung heavy in the air. As the days passed, I began to experience unsettling visions in the depths of my sleep. Dreams of a torrential storm, of anguished cries echoing across a desolate landscape, and of a young face peering at me from the darkness. I awoke drenched in sweat, the remnants of the nightmare lingering in my mind like fragments of a half-remembered truth. I started to question whether my grief had opened a door within me, one that allowed the past to seep into my present. The turning point came on the fourth night. A violent storm erupted without warning. Rain hammered against the RV, and lightning illuminated the forest in brief, blinding flashes. With the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls, I felt compelled to return to the indigenous shrine. Clutching my journal and a small treasured memento, a faded photograph of my late sister, the one loss that had shattered me, I trudged through the pelting rain toward the clearing. The storm seemed to intensify as I neared the shrine. The wind carried an almost tangible charge, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and ancient grief. Reaching the shrine, I arranged the memento among the carefully placed stones and offerings. My hands shook as I whispered an apology, a plea for forgiveness and understanding. I recited the fragmented incantations I had pieced together from the scattered notes and the symbols etched in the trees, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between my personal sorrow and the collective mourning of this sacred land. As I spoke, the spectral figure appeared once more, her form barely discernible in the torrential rain. This time, however, there was a clarity in her sorrow, a raw, unfiltered anguish that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The wind intensified, as if in response to my words, and the hum that had haunted me for days rose to a near-deafening crescendo. In that moment, I realized that the spirit was not merely a passive observer of my grief. She was an embodiment of the land's pain, a living memory of a past that had been violently erased. The storm raged on as I stood there, transfixed by the presence of the ghostly woman. I felt as though time had slowed, each second stretched into an eternity. The ritual, however imperfect and desperate, felt like a bridge, a way to honor both my own loss and the collective tragedy that had marked this place. For a long moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, as suddenly as it had built up, the chaos began to subside. The wind softened, the torrential rain eased into a gentle drizzle, and the humming faded into a quiet murmur. In the eerie calm that followed, I felt a profound sense of acceptance wash over me. The spectral woman lingered for a few moments longer, her eyes reflecting a deep, mournful gratitude, before she slowly faded into the darkness. I remained there at the shrine long after the storm had passed, feeling as though I had borne witness to a communion of souls, a fleeting, sacred exchange between the living and the dead. Over the next several days, life in the forest took on a different hue. The supernatural disturbances did not vanish entirely, but they became less aggressive, a persistent reminder of a history that could never be forgotten, rather than a malevolent force determined to consume me. The RV, battered by both nature and time, continued to be unreliable, yet I learned to embrace the imperfections as part of the journey. Each malfunction, every unexpected creak or sigh of metal, became a part of the tapestry of my experience, a constant reminder that life, in all its fragility, was as transient as the mists that curled around Forgotten Creek. I spent those days exploring further, tracing the origins of the symbols carved in the trees and piecing together the fragmented notes I had found. I spoke to a few locals in nearby Mount Ida, gathering their own stories of loss and mystery, tales of a young man who had vanished without a trace, of a curse born of betrayal, and of a spirit who walked the forest in search of redemption. Their words, steeped in folklore and laced with sorrow, resonated deeply with the transformation I was undergoing. I came to understand that the grief I carried was not solely my own. It was part of a continuum of pain that spanned generations, a collective wound that nature itself seemed determined to heal through remembrance and ritual. By the time I finally decided it was time to leave, I felt both lighter and infinitely more burdened by the weight of history. My journey into solitude had turned into an odyssey of introspection and reconciliation, an intimate dance with the shadows of a past that refused to be silenced. I packed up my belongings and started the RV's reluctant engine for one final trip along the winding road out of the forest. As I drove away from Forgotten Creek, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a glimpse of the spectral woman watching me depart. In the distance, beneath the canopy of ancient trees, I thought I saw a faint, sorrowful figure, an eternal guardian of memories that I would carry with me forever. The experience transformed me in ways I am still coming to terms with. I no longer see isolation as a mere escape from the world. Instead, it has become a conduit for understanding that some wounds, no matter how deeply buried, can only begin to heal when acknowledged. The ghostly presence at the shrine, the mysterious carvings, and the fragmented notes all taught me that history is not something to be forgotten. It is an integral part of who we are, a legacy of pain and beauty that shapes our lives. As I write these words now, in a small apartment far removed from the haunting woods of the Ouachitas, I find that the memories of those days remain vivid and unyielding. The spectral woman's mournful eyes and the soft hum of ancient voices still echo in my dreams. I have come to accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather honored with quiet remembrance and respect. My journey into the heart of Forgotten Creek taught me that the interplay between personal grief and the collective sorrow of the land can forge a path to redemption, a slow, painful healing that acknowledges the past while allowing one to move forward. This is my story, a tale of isolation, loss, and the bittersweet beauty of facing the ghosts that linger in the shadows of forgotten places. In embracing the sorrow etched into the land, I learned that healing often comes not from banishing the past, but from understanding and accepting it. And though the old RV may never run as reliably as it once did, and the memories of those eerie nights will forever haunt the corners of my mind, I now carry with me a quiet strength, the knowledge that even in the deepest darkness, there is a flicker of light waiting to be acknowledged. Every time I close my eyes, I remember the rhythmic hum of the forest, the gentle murmur of Forgotten Creek, and the sorrowful gaze of the woman who once appeared to me. In that fragile balance between life and death, between the past and the present, I found a piece of myself that had long been lost. And so, as I continue on my journey, I do so with a heart that is scarred but wiser, forever touched by the spectral echoes of Forgotten Creek. My name is Anna. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in late October last year on the Devil's Backbone Trail near Bentonville, North Arkansas. I had been yearning for an escape, a break from the relentless pace of urban life, and when Mark, my partner of 3 years, suggested a weekend getaway in our old RV, I eagerly agreed. I had always been the rational one, grounded in science and logic, but Mark's fascination with the paranormal and local legends had slowly chipped away at my certainty. I never imagined that our much-anticipated retreat would plunge us into a nightmare that blurred the lines between myth and reality. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the sky a pale blue, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Our RV was a relic from another era, creaking and rattling as we drove over uneven back roads. Mark was excited, practically buzzing with anticipation as he recounted tales of local ghost lore, stories of the White Lady, a sorrowful spirit said to haunt these very woods. I listened politely, my mind firmly anchored in facts, though a small reluctant part of me wondered if there might be a kernel of truth in the old tales. After nearly 3 hours of winding, rugged roads, we finally arrived at our destination, a secluded clearing along Devil's Backbone. The site was breathtaking. Towering trees encircled a narrow, jagged ridge that looked as if it had been carved by the hands of time itself. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, yet there was an undercurrent of foreboding that I couldn't quite shake. The locals had warned us that cell service was unreliable here, and true enough, the silence on our phones was deafening. The RV, our fragile sanctuary, greeted us with a series of flickers in its aging electrical system. I sighed, already dreading the inevitable mechanical issues that would arise. Mark, ever the optimist in his own unconventional way, brushed it off with a laugh, claiming it added to the authentic backwoods experience. I wasn't so sure. That first night, after setting up our meager camp and sharing a simple dinner over a portable stove, we settled in near the RV's open door. The temperature had dropped, and the whisper of wind through the trees mingled with the occasional rustle of leaves. As the twilight deepened, Mark and I sat side by side, our conversation drifting from everyday concerns to local legends. His eyes lit up when he mentioned that some locals believed the White Lady was not merely a benign spirit, but a harbinger of doom, a soul trapped between worlds, doomed to relive her tragic fate until someone could set her free. I rolled my eyes, dismissing it as another one of those old wives' tales, but as the night progressed, the line between reality and myth began to blur. Around midnight, as I was about to retreat inside the RV to get some sleep, I heard it. A soft, mournful sound, like a distant wail carried on the wind. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the frigid air, and scanned the darkened perimeter. In the dim glow of the RV's interior lights, I could make out the vague shape of a figure at the edge of the tree line. "Mark, do you see that?" I called, my voice trembling more from the cold than fear. He emerged from the RV with a look of eager anticipation, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "I've been waiting for something like this all night," he whispered, eyes wide and fixated on the silhouette. There, standing motionless, was the unmistakable outline of a woman in a long, flowing dress. The fabric seemed to ripple with an otherworldly light, and her hair cascaded like dark, tangled threads. It was the White Lady, exactly as the legends described, her presence both sorrowful and unnerving. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched us with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I felt my logical mind screaming that it must be a trick of the light, a mere play of shadows. Yet, deep down, an instinct told me otherwise. Mark, on the other hand, was transfixed, silently urging me to step closer. I refused. Something about that spectral gaze felt like a silent plea for help or a warning of impending danger. The following morning, the tension between us was palpable. Over breakfast, more like reheated coffee and stale biscuits, I couldn't help but express my concerns. "Mark, last night was unsettling. I don't like it. I don't like the idea of chasing ghosts or invoking old curses." Mark's response was calm but tinged with a fervor I hadn't seen before. "Anna, don't you feel it? The energy in these woods, this is real. The White Lady isn't just a myth. I've been researching local records and found that she's tied to a series of tragic events. People who encountered her were never the same." I wanted to protest, to remind him that logical explanations were always available. But my words died in my throat as I noticed the RV's interior lights flickering again. The electrical faults had grown more frequent, almost as if something was deliberately tampering with them. At first, I blamed the age of our RV, but a creeping unease made me wonder if there was something more sinister at work. That afternoon, we decided to explore a nearby abandoned cabin that Mark had read about in an old journal he'd found online. The cabin, said to be the last vestige of a once thriving homestead, was rumored to be connected to the White Lady's tragic past. The structure was dilapidated, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of time. As we stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and the remnants of old photographs and handwritten notes hinted at a sorrowful history. Mark's eyes gleamed with excitement as he examined a faded portrait of a young woman in a white dress. "This is her," he said softly, almost reverently. "Her name was Evelyn. They say she was betrayed by someone she loved, left to die in the woods. Her spirit couldn't find peace." I felt a surge of sympathy mixed with dread. The cabin itself seemed to mourn her, its broken windows and creaking floorboards echoing the lament of a lost soul. As we stood there, absorbed in the silent tragedy, I heard a low, almost imperceptible murmur behind us. When I turned around, there was nothing, only the oppressive stillness of the cabin. Yet, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Over the next few days, our trip devolved into a relentless battle against both the elements and an unseen, malevolent force. The RV's sporadic malfunctions forced us to rely on a small generator that seemed to groan under the weight of the mountain chill. Mark's fervor only grew, and he began documenting every unexplained occurrence with a handheld recorder, convinced that the evidence would vindicate his beliefs. Meanwhile, I tried desperately to maintain some semblance of normalcy, rationalizing each eerie event as a series of unfortunate coincidences. One night, as a heavy fog rolled in from the ridge, the supernatural manifestations intensified. I was awoken by the sound of shattering glass, a violent crash that reverberated through the RV. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding in my ears. Outside, the fog had transformed the world into an indistinct blur, shadows morphing into grotesque forms. I stumbled to the window and peered out, straining to make sense of the darkness. There, in the fog, I caught sight of several figures moving with unnatural agility. They weren't just human. They seemed to shift, their forms flickering like poorly tuned signals on an old television. My blood ran cold as I realized these might be the skinwalkers, the shape-shifting entities that local legends said could assume the guise of both man and beast. I rushed to wake Mark, who was already outside, his eyes fixed on the spectral parade. "Mark, what is that?" I cried, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. He didn't answer immediately, his attention locked on a figure that bore an uncanny resemblance to the White Lady. In the ensuing moments, the figures converged near the RV, and a palpable sense of dread filled the air. It was as if the very fabric of reality was tearing, and we were caught in its pull. The generator sputtered and died, plunging us into a suffocating darkness broken only by the eerie glow of the moon. Panic gripped me. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. Mark grabbed my hand, and we stumbled toward the RV, our footsteps lost in the relentless whispering of the fog. But the supernatural presence was relentless. I felt an icy hand on my shoulder, a touch that wasn't there a moment before, and spun around, only to see nothing but the swirling mist. Inside the RV, we frantically tried to restart the engine, cursing the temperamental machine. Every attempt was met with a series of coughing sputters and brief, mocking flickers of light. It was as if the very spirit of the land was determined to trap us here. The conflict between Mark's desperate hope and my mounting terror created a rift between us. Our whispered arguments in the cramped space were drowned out by the supernatural cacophony outside. Desperation drove us to seek refuge in the old cabin we had visited earlier. It was a place of sorrow and secrets, yet it seemed the only shelter available in the midst of the relentless storm. We dragged our meager belongings and hurried down the uneven path, the forest closing in around us. The fog was so dense that I could barely see my hand in front of my face, and every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. At the cabin, we locked the door behind us and huddled together in the dim light of a single, sputtering lantern. Mark's recorder was still running, capturing every whisper of the wind and the distant, anguished cries that now filled the air. I could see the strain on his face. His belief, once a source of comfort, had now become an obsession, pushing him towards dangerous, uncharted territory. "It's here, Anna," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "The spirit is with us. I can feel it." I tried to reassure him, though my own voice trembled with uncertainty. "Maybe it's just the storm. The wind can do strange things in these old places." But, deep down, I knew that the events of the past days could not be dismissed as mere tricks of nature. The White Lady, Evelyn, as Mark had insisted, was not a benign presence. The very air around us seemed charged with her sorrow and rage. Late that night, as we lay on a threadbare couch in the cabin, I awoke to the sound of soft weeping. I sat up, straining to see through the darkness, and there she was, a luminous figure in a flowing white dress, standing at the foot of the stairs. Her eyes were pools of despair, and her mouth moved soundlessly as if recounting a long-forgotten tragedy. I froze, every rational thought dissolving into raw, primal fear. Mark, who had been asleep beside me, bolted upright. "It's her," he whispered, both awed and terrified. "It's Evelyn." The ghost's gaze met mine, and in that moment I felt a profound sadness, a longing to be freed from an eternal torment. But with that sadness came a surge of malevolence. The air around her shimmered, and the sound of distant, anguished screams echoed through the cabin. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature plummeted. I clutched Mark's hand, and together we realized that our survival hinged on confronting this dark presence head-on. In the following hours, we scoured the cabin for any clues: old journals, handwritten letters, anything that could explain Evelyn's tragic end. In a hidden compartment beneath a rotting floorboard, we found an old diary. Its pages detailed a tale of betrayal and sorrow. Evelyn had been wronged by someone dear, left to wander these woods as a spirit, cursed to repeat the cycle of her agony. The diary hinted at an ancient local ritual, one that might finally bring her peace and, in doing so, break the curse that bound her to the land. With the storm raging outside and the ghost's presence growing ever more oppressive, Mark and I made a desperate decision. We would attempt the ritual described in the diary, even if it meant tampering with forces far beyond our understanding. The instructions were cryptic, a blend of indigenous folklore and old-world mysticism. All we had was a handful of salt, a scrap of faded cloth, and a silver pendant that Mark had found at a local antique shop weeks before. The ritual required us to confront the spirit, acknowledge her pain, and offer her a chance at redemption. At midnight, we gathered in the center of the cabin's main room. Mark's recorder lay silent on the table as he read aloud the incantations from the diary. The temperature dropped even further, and the lantern's flame danced wildly as if buffeted by an unseen force. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, addressing the apparition with as much calm as I could muster. "Evelyn," I said softly, "we know your sorrow. We know you were wronged, and we want to help you find peace." My voice wavered as I continued. "If you can forgive those who betrayed you, if you can let go of your pain, please, release us from this torment." For a long, agonizing moment, The cabin fell into an eerie silence. Then, with a sudden gust of wind, the white lady stepped forward. Her form shuddered, as if caught between worlds. The sorrow in her eyes deepened, and I sensed a battle within her, one between lingering vengeance and the desperate yearning for release. Mark's voice broke the silence. "Evelyn, we offer you this token of peace," he said, holding out the silver pendant and the scrap of cloth. "Let these be symbols of your freedom. Allow yourself to rest." The room quaked violently, and the ghost's form wavered like a mirage. In that critical moment, I realized that the spirit's aggression had never been random. It was the manifestation of unresolved pain. The ghost's mournful wail filled the cabin, mingling with the clamor of the storm outside. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice. One misstep, and we would be swallowed by an abyss of despair. Time seemed to slow as the spirit reached out a spectral hand toward the tokens we offered. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. With a final, heart-wrenching cry that reverberated in my soul, the white lady's form began to dissipate, like smoke carried away by the wind. The oppressive chill lifted, and the tempest outside gradually subsided into a mournful drizzle. For several long minutes we stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just transpired sinking in. Had we truly succeeded in releasing Evelyn from her eternal torment, or had we merely delayed an inevitable cycle of horror? I couldn't be sure. But as the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness through the broken windows, I sensed a fragile calm, a promise that the worst might be over. In the days that followed, the haunted occurrences diminished. The RV, though still temperamental, functioned well enough to get us back to civilization. Yet, the experience left deep scars on both our psyches. Mark's obsession with the paranormal, once a shared passion, now took on a more somber hue. He spent hours poring over local archives and interviewing wary locals, seeking to understand the true nature of the curse that had nearly claimed us. I, on the other hand, found my once unshakable rationality irrevocably altered. I began to appreciate that there were realms beyond scientific explanation, a realization both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Our relationship, tested in the crucible of terror, emerged changed. The tension that had once divided us gave way to a mutual respect for the unknown and an understanding of the delicate balance between belief and skepticism. We never spoke of that fateful weekend in detail, as if the memories were too potent, too raw to be dissected in everyday conversation. Yet, every time we encountered a shadow that lingered a bit too long or heard a whisper on the wind, we exchanged a knowing look, a silent acknowledgement of the dark truth we had uncovered. Even now, months later, when I find myself alone on a chilly night, I can almost feel Evelyn's presence, a gentle reminder that some spirits are not meant to haunt us with malevolence, but to guide us toward an understanding of the mysteries that bind us all. My life had been forever altered by that encounter on Devil's Backbone. The rational world I once believed in had cracked open, revealing a deeper, more intricate tapestry of existence, one where love, loss, and the supernatural interwove in ways that defied explanation. I often wonder if we truly set Evelyn free, or if she lingers still, a silent guardian of the trail, waiting for the next soul brave enough to seek solace in these ancient woods. And though the terror of that weekend still echoes in my dreams, I have learned that survival is not just about escaping the horrors of the night, it's about embracing them, understanding that every ghost, every shadow, has a story that is both tragic and transformative. This experience taught me that sometimes the greatest journeys are not measured in miles traveled, but in the depths of our own fear and the courage it takes to face it. My name is Anna, and I survived the whispers on Devil's Backbone, not unscathed, but with a newfound wisdom and a heart forever open to the mysteries of life. My name is Jake. I'm 42 years old, and this happened in early October near the Buffalo National River in northern Arkansas. I had reached a point in my life where the weight of loss and guilt had become unbearable. After my wife's tragic death, I retreated into solitude, seeking solace in the wild, open spaces where I could escape the incessant reminders of urban life and my own failures. My aging RV, my sole companion on this journey, was my ticket to a quiet refuge, until the past, in more ways than one, caught up with me. I set out on a cool, crisp morning, with the leaves already beginning their slow transformation from vibrant green to fiery shades of red and gold. The road was long and winding, bordered by thick forests that hinted at secrets older than time. I wasn't sure what I expected to find along the Buffalo National River, perhaps just the kind of isolation that might help mend a broken spirit, but I never anticipated the dark legacy hidden within these woods. A few hours into my journey, while driving on a narrow back road lined with towering oaks and maples, the RV's old radio suddenly crackled to life. I leaned forward, trying to catch a clear signal, but what emerged was a series of strange, garbled voices speaking in an indigenous language I didn't recognize. The static was punctuated by odd, rhythmic patterns that sent a chill down my spine. I dismissed it at first as interference or a malfunction, but deep down, I sensed it was something more. A warning, perhaps, or an echo of the past. When I finally pulled over to set up camp for the night, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was watching me. The RV, already temperamental, began to act up. Lights flickered erratically, and the engine coughed as if reluctant to continue its journey. I tried to fix minor issues with a set of worn-out tools, but the persistent malfunctions only added to my growing unease. That first night, as darkness enveloped the camp, I sat on a creaking fold-out chair outside the RV, wrapped in an old blanket, and listened to the forest. The silence was punctuated by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. But beneath those natural sounds, I could have sworn I heard soft, almost imperceptible whispers on the wind, whispers that seemed to call my name in a tone both sorrowful and accusatory. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the wind playing tricks with the trees, or my tired mind conjuring illusions. Yet, every time I closed my eyes, the whispers returned. They were accompanied by fleeting glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow that flitted among the trees, always just out of clear sight. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was simply on edge after months of solitude, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining everything. The following morning, still shaken from the night's events, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. While hiking along a narrow trail near the riverbank, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath a thick growth of ivy and moss was an old, weathered shrine. Its stone altar was covered in strange carvings and symbols, and scattered around were relics that looked disturbingly out of place. A fragment of tattered cloth, a small wooden talisman, and shards of pottery decorated with unsettling designs. The inscriptions on the stone hinted at rituals performed centuries ago by a cannibal cult, one that local lore suggested had once roamed these lands. The idea was both horrifying and mesmerizing, a dark chapter of history long buried under time and nature, yet its echoes remained. I carefully pocketed the talisman, its surface rough and imbued with a strange energy, and made my way back to the RV, my mind a swirling vortex of fear and curiosity. What did these relics mean? Were they connected to the mysterious voices on the radio? And, most unsettling of all, did they have anything to do with the feeling of being watched? That evening, as dusk began to settle over the river, I returned to my campsite. The RV's internal lights had gone out completely, leaving me in a near total darkness except for the weak glow of my flashlight. I sat inside, listening to the increasing intensity of the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. They were joined by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate steps that circled the RV. I peered out of the window and, in the dim light, caught sight of a figure in the distance. Clad in tattered, archaic clothing that looked as if it belonged to a different era, the figure moved with an eerie, inhuman grace along the trail. For a moment, I thought it might have been a local drifter, but something in its eyes, a burning intensity that seemed to mirror my own despair, suggested it was something far more sinister. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, I decided to stay awake, watching, waiting as the night wore on. The RV's radio, which had been silent for hours, erupted once more with that strange indigenous language. This time, however, the message was clearer, almost like an incantation. I couldn't understand the words, but their rhythm and cadence filled me with a deep, primal fear. Over the next few days, the supernatural events escalated. The RV's electrical system continued to fail unpredictably, leaving me stranded in near darkness during the nights. I tried to fix the issues, but every attempt seemed to be thwarted by a force I couldn't name. A force that seemed determined to keep me isolated and alone in this forsaken part of the forest. I began to see the mysterious figure more frequently. At first, it appeared only in the periphery, a fleeting glimpse between the trees. But soon, it began to follow me. I would catch it at a distance, its form shifting in the shadows, always watching. One night, as a violent storm broke out, I saw something even more terrifying. Amidst the torrential rain and howling wind, the figure moved closer to the RV. I stepped outside, rain pelting my face, and shone my flashlight toward it. The light revealed a horrifying transformation. The figure's features began to distort, slowly morphing until, for a split second, I saw my own face staring back at me. It was as if the entity was wearing a mask, a spectral doppelganger that embodied all my inner guilt and sorrow. I retreated back into the RV, my heart pounding furiously. I sat in the dark, the image of my own distorted face seared into my mind. Was it my imagination, a trick of the storm, or had something truly sinister taken hold? A force that not only haunted these woods but had chosen me as its target? Desperation clawed at me. I knew I needed answers, and that meant revisiting the shrine I had discovered earlier. Armed with my flashlight and the indigenous talisman clutched tightly in my hand, I ventured out into the storm. The forest was a chaotic mass of sound and movement. The wind howled through the trees, and every rustle seemed to be a whisper of the past. I trudged along the muddy path until I reached the clearing where the ancient shrine lay. The stone altar stood silently, its carvings illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning. I knelt before it, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on me, and examined the relics with trembling hands. I pulled out a battered notebook from my RV, one in which I had jotted down odd occurrences during my travels, and compared my notes with the symbols etched into the stone. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The carvings told a story of a vengeful spirit, a being born of betrayal and unspeakable atrocities committed by an ancient cannibal cult. This spirit was said to prey on those burdened with guilt and regret, manifesting as a doppelganger to force its victims to confront their inner demons. The indigenous talisman, I realized, was not just an artifact. It was a key, a means to perform a ritual that might appease the spirit and perhaps set it free. That night, I returned to the RV with a newfound sense of urgency. I spent hours poring over my notebook, deciphering the fragmented inscriptions and piecing together a rudimentary ritual. The plan was simple, yet terrifying. I would confront the entity head-on, using the talisman and the ritual's incantation to force it to reveal its true nature and, hopefully, to grant me the redemption I so desperately sought. At midnight, with the storm still raging outside, I stepped out into the cold, lonesome night. The RV's interior was dark, and I could hear the persistent murmurs of the forest as if it were alive with secrets. I found a relatively sheltered spot near the river's edge, away from the flickering, failing lights of the RV, and began the ritual. My hands shook as I clutched the talisman, feeling its rough surface, as if it were trying to communicate some long-forgotten truth. "Spirits of these ancient woods," I began, my voice barely a whisper over the cacophony of the storm, "I know your sorrow. I know the guilt that binds you. Show yourself, that I may face the truth and find redemption." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. The storm's fury seemed to mask any sign of a response, and I felt a crushing loneliness that threatened to swallow me whole. Then, as if the wind itself had carried my words to some dark, hidden corner of the forest, I saw it, a shape emerging from the gloom. At first, it appeared as a simple silhouette against the torrential rain, but as it drew closer, its features became clear. The figure wore the remnants of archaic clothing, and its eyes burned with a ferocious intensity. And then, in a moment that will forever haunt my memories, the figure's face began to contort until it became my own. A perfect, haunting reflection of every regret, every mistake, every ounce of guilt that had tormented me since my wife's passing. I stood frozen, heart pounding, as the doppelganger took a step forward. The storm seemed to crescendo in that moment, thunder crashing overhead as if the heavens themselves were condemning this unholy convergence. My voice, barely audible, trembled as I repeated the incantation from my notes, each word a plea for forgiveness and release. Let the pain be lifted. Let the guilt be unbound. I offer you redemption if you can face your truth. For what felt like an eternity, the two of us, the living and the spectral reflection, stood facing each other in the merciless rain. I could feel the presence of something ancient and vengeful stirring in the darkness, something that had lain dormant for centuries and was now awakened by my desperate need for absolution. The figure's eyes, my eyes, seemed to search mine, and in that gaze I recognized not only my own sorrow, but also a deeper, primordial anguish that belonged to the spirit of the long-dead cult member whose tragic fate had bound it to these lands. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the rain slowed to a mournful drizzle. I felt the talisman grow warm in my hand, a sign, perhaps, that the ritual was working, that the ancient spirit was responding. Slowly, the spectral doppelganger's features softened, the distortion receding as if it were shedding a layer of torment. With a final anguished cry that merged with the sound of the river's ceaseless flow, the entity began to dissolve into the darkness, leaving behind only a lingering echo of its presence. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted and overwhelmed by the catharsis of that confrontation. The storm, too, began to abate, and the oppressive weight that had pressed upon my soul for so long started to lift. In that quiet aftermath, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that the supernatural terror I had faced was not merely an external manifestation of ancient evil, but a mirror reflecting the deepest parts of myself. In the days that followed, the RV's systems gradually returned to normal, as if the land itself acknowledged my victory. The incessant whispers and ghostly figures receded, replaced by the steady, comforting rhythm of nature. Yet the memory of those harrowing nights lingered, etched into my mind like scars that would never fully fade. I spent long hours by the river, sometimes writing in my journal, sometimes just staring into the dark water reflecting on the ordeal. I began to understand that confronting the supernatural wasn't solely about warding off an external threat. It was about facing my own inner darkness. The vengeful spirit I encountered was a personification of my guilt, a reminder that true healing required me to accept my past rather than run from it. In that acceptance, I found a measure of redemption, though the process was far from complete. Months later, I left the Buffalo National River behind, returning to a world that seemed both less and more familiar. The experience had changed me irrevocably. I wasn't the solitary, haunted man who had driven into those ancient woods. I was someone who had faced his inner demons and emerged with a fragile hope for the future. The relics I had recovered from the shrine now sat on my mantle, silent reminders of a night when the past and the supernatural collided in a maelstrom of terror and revelation. Every so often, when a chill wind blows or the radio in my car crackles unexpectedly, I am reminded of that stormy night by the river. I recall the spectral face that mirrored my own, the sorrow and rage that danced in its eyes, and the moment when I learned that healing often comes at the price of confronting the darkest parts of ourselves. Today, I share my story not as a tale of horror, but as a testament to the power of redemption and the resilience of the human spirit. The Buffalo National River remains a place of both beauty and mystery, a living reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. And while I sometimes wonder if the spirit I confronted might one day return, I also know that I am no longer the same man who once trembled in the darkness. I have learned that the journey toward healing is fraught with peril, but it is also illuminated by the light of self-forgiveness. My name is Jake. I'm 42 years old, and I face the shadows of my past in the banks of the Buffalo National River. I learned that some encounters with the supernatural are not just about fighting evil, they are about reconciling with the pain that lies within us. And in that reconciliation, there is a chance for true redemption. My name is Jack Harper. I'm 32 years old. This happened in the heart of the Ozark National Forest, where my friends and I set out on what was meant to be a carefree escape from the burdens of our daily lives. I still remember the first day we hit the dusty backroads in our aging RV, the metal groaning under the strain of countless miles. I never imagined that our journey would soon twist into a nightmare, a struggle for survival against an ancient evil that stalked the shadows. I had planned the trip with great care, or so I thought. Alongside me were my two closest friends, Emily Carson, a 29-year-old artist with an uncanny sensitivity to the moods of nature, and Aaron Lee, a 35-year-old adventurer with a penchant for recklessness. We craved a break from the chaos of urban life, and the rugged, storied trails of North Arkansas promised us a refuge into nature's raw beauty. But even as we drove deeper into the forest, I sensed that something was amiss. The RV was barely holding together. Its generator sputtered intermittently, and every bump in the road seemed to echo like a harbinger of further trouble. Our cell phones were mostly useless, leaving us stranded in a silent wilderness where the only voices were the wind and our own anxious thoughts. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Aaron's ceaseless banter and daring attitude clashed with my cautious, methodical approach. Emily, on the other hand, grew increasingly quiet, as if each mile further eroded her usual optimism. Our first real sign that something was off came on the second morning of our trip. We had parked near a clearing, setting up camp with the sun barely climbing over the horizon. I decided to stretch my legs and take a short hike along a narrow, winding trail. As I walked among ancient trees draped in mist, I stumbled upon strange markings carved into the bark. The symbols were intricate. twisted patterns that resembled indigenous art, yet there was something disturbingly sinister about them. They seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl. I took a few photos, thinking they might be remnants of old tribal rituals, but a gnawing dread told me these were not just art. They were warnings. Later that evening, as dusk settled in, the atmosphere around our camp grew oppressive. The RV's lights cast long, jittery shadows, and an unsettling chorus of rustling leaves and distant whispers filled the air. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to my overactive imagination. Yet, every sound, every creak of the old vehicle made me wonder if something was watching us. It was during a short walk to clear our heads that Emily and I discovered an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the forest. The structure, nearly swallowed by ivy and decay, seemed frozen in time. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and a desperate need for distraction, we approached. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and forgotten memories. Scattered about were old belongings, faded photographs, a broken locket, and a pile of weathered diaries that hinted at a dark past. One diary in particular caught my eye. Its pages detailed the life of a woman accused of witchcraft, known locally as the Crone of the Ozarks. According to the entries, she had been a healer who turned to forbidden practices after a personal tragedy, and the local indigenous people, in a desperate bid to protect their lands, branded her a witch. Over time, however, the legend had twisted, painting her as an embodiment of malice, a vengeful spirit who now haunted these woods. As I read, I could feel a cold sweat break out along my spine, each line deepening the sense of foreboding that had plagued me since our arrival. That night, as we gathered around a flickering campfire outside the RV, the atmosphere grew palpably tense. Aaron joked nervously about our misadventures, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Emily sat silently, her gaze fixed on the dark tree line as if she could see something I couldn't. Then, as the flames danced and shadows swirled, I saw her, a hunched, spectral figure at the edge of our light. She moved with a slow, deliberate gait, her tattered clothes and wild hair hinting at another era. For a moment, time froze. The figure's eyes, hollow and piercing, locked onto mine before she melted back into the darkness. I felt an instinctive terror that paralyzed me. Was this the witch from the diary? A ghost conjured by our fears, or something even more malevolent? I tried to wake Aaron and Emily, but the weight of dread held me captive. When I finally managed to rouse them, I found that neither of them had seen the figure. Yet, the tension in the air was undeniable, and a silent agreement passed among us. We were not alone. The following day brought no respite. Our RV's troubles worsened as the generator failed completely, leaving us without any power in the depths of the forest. With our communication cut off, the isolation became suffocating. The strange markings on the trees and the eerie sounds of the night began to dominate our every thought. We tried to press on with our original plans, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. Paths became muddled, and our sense of direction disintegrated. It was on one of these errant hikes that disaster struck. Aaron, ever the risk-taker, decided to forge ahead alone, insisting he knew a shortcut back to the campsite. I begged him not to, but his cocky confidence prevailed. Hours later, when he hadn't returned, Emily and I set off in search of him. We eventually found him near a rocky outcrop, slumped against a tree, his face ashen, and his body battered by what appeared to be a vicious assault. His wounds were deep, and his breathing was shallow, the result of what we could only describe as a savage attack. Aaron mumbled incoherently about a violent presence, a force that had struck him without warning. The physical evidence was undeniable. fresh, ragged scratches and bruises that told the story of a feral, almost animalistic brutality. We managed to drag him back to the RV, but the damage was done. Aaron's condition deteriorated rapidly, and as the night approached, it became clear that we were in the clutches of something truly malevolent. That night, as Aaron slipped in and out of consciousness, the supernatural assaults escalated. The spectral witch seemed to take pleasure in tormenting us. I awoke to the sound of scraping at the RV's exterior and found dark, muddy footprints leading away from the vehicle. Emily, ever perceptive, reported hearing soft, almost sorrowful chants emanating from the forest, as if the very trees were whispering secrets of old. In my heart, I knew that the witch was no mere ghost. She was a violent, vengeful entity, driven by an ancient curse and the dark energies of the land. Aaron's condition worsened despite our attempts at care. His bleeding was relentless, and he began to hallucinate, claiming that the witch was calling him by name. In his delirium, he described how her twisted, spectral hand had reached out to him in the darkness, leaving him with deep, unexplainable scars. I could do nothing but hold him and try to keep him conscious, while Emily clutched the diary we had found, her eyes wide with terror and determination. With dawn barely breaking through the dense canopy, we made a desperate decision. The diary hinted at a ritual, an ancient counter-ritual that could weaken the witch's hold over the land if performed correctly. It was a risky, desperate gambit, one that required both our faith in the old legends and our willingness to confront the supernatural head-on. Despite our battered spirits, we gathered what little supplies we had, using the RV's remaining resources to piece together a makeshift altar in a clearing near the abandoned cabin. As I began to recite the incantations from the diary, Emily and I could almost feel the temperature drop further, the air thickening with a malevolent presence. The forest fell into an unnerving silence, broken only by the rhythmic murmur of our voices and the pounding of our hearts. For a brief, tense moment, it seemed as if the witch's spirit was gathering around us, her presence an oppressive weight pressing down on our very souls. Then, in a violent burst of energy, the clearing erupted into chaos. The spectral figure of the witch materialized before our eyes, her form more terrifying and vivid than ever. Dark, writhing shadows coalesced around her, and her eyes blazed with a fury that defied description. She shrieked, a sound that was both mournful and horrifying, and lunged toward us. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I pushed Emily back, my mind locked in a battle between terror and determination. The air around us crackled with supernatural energy as the witch's assault intensified. I tried to continue the ritual, my voice trembling yet resolute, while Emily clutched the diary as if it were a lifeline. The spectral attack was not merely a passive haunting. It was violent, ferocious, and unyielding. In the midst of the chaos, Aaron's condition took a fatal turn. The wounds he had sustained were too severe, and despite our frantic efforts to stabilize him, he slipped away, leaving us in a void of grief and fear. His loss was a brutal, painful reminder that this malevolent force was not just a trick of the mind, but a tangible, deadly enemy. The sight of his lifeless form only steeled my resolve. We had to end this, or we would be consumed by it. As the witch closed in, her form shifting between that of a crone and a hideous specter, Emily and I pressed on with the ritual. With each word we spoke, the air around us shimmered, as if reality itself was warping under the pressure of ancient magic. The diary's instructions were precise, yet ambiguous, a puzzle we had to solve amidst terror. Every carved symbol in the trees, every whispering echo, seemed to confirm that we were tapping into a deep, primal force that the witch commanded. I could feel the energy in the clearing intensify, a crescendo of supernatural power that left my limbs trembling. The witch's shrieks mingled with the wind, and for a terrifying moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. Emily's eyes, wide with both terror and fierce determination, locked with mine, and in that silent exchange, we knew we were the only ones who could break the curse that had haunted these woods for centuries. In a final desperate surge, we recited the last lines of the ritual. The ground beneath us shuddered, and the oppressive darkness seemed to recede momentarily. The witch recoiled, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. It was as if the ancient words had stripped her of some of her power, forcing her to retreat into the shadows. But the battle was far from over. With a final guttural cry, she lunged at us one last time. I threw myself in front of Emily, feeling the icy grip of fear and the sting of spectral claws that tore at the air around me. The impact was like a collision of worlds. Physical pain mingled with the raw force of otherworldly malice. I could barely stand, my body trembling with exhaustion and the shock of the encounter. Yet, in that moment, the forest itself seemed to come alive, as if offering its reluctant aid. A sudden gust of wind scattered the leaves, and the symbols carved into the nearby trees glowed faintly, their light a beacon of ancient power. I shouted for Emily to keep reciting the incantations, my voice raw with determination despite the agony coursing through me. The spectral witch faltered, her form wavering as if caught in a sudden, inexplicable storm. Her furious eyes locked onto mine, and for an agonizing heartbeat, I felt her malice seep into my very soul. But I refused to yield. With one final resounding declaration, Emily and I completed the ritual. The witch's scream echoed through the forest, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the night. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the oppressive presence lifted. The dark shadows receded, and the unnatural chill dissipated. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, while Emily knelt beside me, her eyes brimming with tears. Tears for Aaron, for the terror we had endured, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. In the quiet aftermath, we gathered our remaining strength to tend to the wreckage around us. The RV, our once trusted refuge, sat silent and lifeless, a stark reminder of our isolation and the frailty of our human constructs against the supernatural. We made the agonizing decision to leave the cursed clearing and attempt an escape. Every step away from that haunted spot felt like a victory over the evil that had nearly claimed our lives. As we drove away on the narrow, winding roads of the Ozark National Forest, the memory of that night was etched into my mind like a scar. The loss of Aaron, the harrowing encounter with the witch, and the raw terror of facing an ancient curse would haunt me for years to come. Yet, in that escape, there was also a glimmer of hope, an understanding that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit could muster the strength to fight back. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my small apartment far from the forest, I still hear the echoes of that night. The diary, now filled with my own frantic annotations, serves as a grim reminder of the forces that lurk in the forgotten corners of our world. I often wonder if the witch will ever return to reclaim her dominion over the Ozarks, or if our desperate ritual merely delayed the inevitable. Emily has since left town, unable to bear the constant reminders of our shared nightmare. I carry on, a solitary figure burdened by the memories of Aaron's sacrifice and the relentless whispers of the forest. There are nights when I awaken to the sound of rustling leaves and soft, haunting chants, and I question whether the evil we encountered is truly vanquished or simply lying dormant, waiting for another chance to rise. In the end, the experience taught me that survival in the wilderness is not just a matter of battling nature's elements or human frailties. It is about confronting the darkness that resides within and around us. The Ozark National Forest, with its ancient trees and hidden secrets, remains a place of both breathtaking beauty and unspeakable horror. And while I may never return to those cursed woods, their memory is forever intertwined with my own, a constant reminder that some legends are born of truth, and that the past, with all its horrors, is never truly gone. I often find myself asking, what price did we pay for our brief taste of freedom? For me, the answer is clear. We paid with the blood of our friend, with sleepless nights and shattered peace of mind, and with the knowledge that some evils are as old as the land itself. The curse of the Ozark witch is not just a tale of supernatural terror. It is a story of survival, loss, and the unyielding struggle between the fragile human spirit and the relentless forces that lie in wait in the darkened corners of the world. My name is Jack Harper, and I am haunted by those memories every day. The lessons learned in the depths of that cursed forest have left an indelible mark on my soul. A mark that reminds me to tread carefully in the shadows, where ancient curses and restless spirits await those who dare to disturb their slumber. Even now, as I look out my window at the night sky, I sometimes catch a glimpse of movement among the trees, a subtle reminder that the darkness is never far behind. And though I strive to move forward, the echoes of that terrifying weekend continue to whisper, a grim warning that in the Ozarks, legends never truly die. My name is Jack Harper. I'm 32 years old. This happened in the heart of the Ozark National Forest, where my friends and I set out on what was meant to be a carefree escape from the burdens of our daily lives. I still remember the first day we hit the dusty backroads in our aging RV, the metal groaning under the strain of countless miles. I never imagined that our journey would soon twist into a nightmare, a struggle for survival against an ancient evil that stalked the shadows. I had planned the trip with great care, or so I thought. Alongside me were my two closest friends, Emily Carson, a 29-year-old artist with an uncanny sensitivity to the moods of nature, and Aaron Lee, a 35-year-old adventurer with a penchant for recklessness. We craved a break from the chaos of urban life, and the rugged, storied trails of North Arkansas promised us a refuge into nature's raw beauty. But even as we drove deeper into the forest, I sensed that something was amiss. The RV was barely holding together. Its generator sputtered intermittently, and every bump in the road seemed to echo like a harbinger of further trouble. Our cell phones were mostly useless, leaving us stranded in a silent wilderness where the only voices were the wind and our own anxious thoughts. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Aaron's ceaseless banter and daring attitude clashed with my cautious, methodical approach. Emily, on the other hand, grew increasingly quiet, as if each mile further eroded her usual optimism. Our first real sign that something was off came on the second morning of our trip. We had parked near a clearing, setting up camp with the sun barely climbing over the horizon. I decided to stretch my legs and take a short hike along a narrow, winding trail. As I walked among ancient trees draped in mist, I stumbled upon strange markings carved into the bark. The symbols were intricate, twisted patterns that resembled indigenous art, yet there was something disturbingly sinister about them. They seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl. I took a few photos, thinking they might be remnants of old tribal rituals, but a gnawing dread told me these were not just art. They were warnings. Later that evening, as dusk settled in, the atmosphere around our camp grew oppressive. The RV's lights cast long, jittery shadows, and an unsettling chorus of rustling leaves and distant whispers filled the air. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to my overactive imagination. Yet, every sound, every creak of the old vehicle made me wonder if something was watching us. It was during a short walk to clear our heads that Emily and I discovered an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the forest. The structure, nearly swallowed by ivy and decay, seemed frozen in time. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and a desperate need for distraction, we approached. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and forgotten memories. Scattered about were old belongings, faded photographs, a broken locket, and a pile of weathered diaries that hinted at a dark past. One diary in particular caught my eye. Its pages detailed the life of a woman accused of witchcraft, known locally as the Crone of the Ozarks. According to the entries, she had been a healer who turned to forbidden practices after a personal tragedy, and the local indigenous people, in a desperate bid to protect their lands, branded her a witch. Over time, however, the legend had twisted, painting her as an embodiment of malice, a vengeful spirit who now haunted these woods. As I read, I could feel a cold sweat break out along my spine, each line deepening the sense of foreboding that had plagued me since our arrival. That night, as we gathered around a flickering campfire outside the RV, the atmosphere grew palpably tense. Aaron joked nervously about our misadventures, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Emily sat silently, her gaze fixed on the dark tree line as if she could see something I couldn't. Then, as the flames danced and shadows swirled, I saw her, a hunched, spectral figure at the edge of our light. She moved with a slow, deliberate gait, her tattered clothes and wild hair hinting at another era. For a moment, time froze. The figure's eyes, hollow and piercing, locked onto mine before she melted back into the darkness. I felt an instinctive terror that paralyzed me. Was this the witch from the diary? A ghost conjured by our fears, or something even more malevolent? I tried to wake Aaron and Emily, but the weight of dread held me captive. When I finally managed to rouse them, I found that neither of them had seen the figure. Yet, the tension in the air was undeniable, and a silent agreement passed among us. We were not alone. The following day brought no respite. Our RV's troubles worsened as the generator failed completely, leaving us without any power in the depths of the forest. With our communication cut off, the isolation became suffocating. The strange markings on the trees and the eerie sounds of the night began to dominate our every thought. We tried to press on with our original plans, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. Paths became muddled, and our sense of direction disintegrated. It was on one of these errant hikes that disaster struck. Aaron, ever the risk-taker, decided to forge ahead alone, insisting he knew a shortcut back to the campsite. I begged him not to, but his cocky confidence prevailed. Hours later, when he hadn't returned, Emily and I set off in search of him. We eventually found him near a rocky outcrop, slumped against a tree, his face ashen and his body battered by what appeared to be a vicious assault. His wounds were deep, and his breathing was shallow, the result of what we could only describe as a savage attack. Aaron mumbled incoherently about a violent presence, a force that had struck him without warning. The physical evidence was undeniable. Fresh, ragged scratches and bruises that told the story of a feral, almost animalistic brutality. We managed to drag him back to the RV, but the damage was done. Aaron's condition deteriorated rapidly, and as the night approached, it became clear that we were in the clutches of something truly malevolent. That night, as Aaron slipped in and out of consciousness, the supernatural assaults escalated. The spectral witch seemed to take pleasure in tormenting us. I awoke to the sound of scraping at the RV's exterior and found dark, muddy footprints leading away from the vehicle. Emily, ever perceptive, reported hearing soft, almost sorrowful chants emanating from the forest, as if the very trees were whispering secrets of old. In my heart, I knew that the witch was no mere ghost. She was a violent, vengeful entity, driven by an ancient curse and the dark energies of the land. Aaron's condition worsened despite our attempts at care. His bleeding was relentless, and he began to hallucinate, claiming that the witch was calling him by name. In his delirium, he described how her twisted, spectral hand had reached out to him in the darkness, leaving him with deep, unexplainable scars. I could do nothing but hold him and try to keep him conscious, while Emily clutched the diary we had found, her eyes wide with terror and determination. With dawn barely breaking through the dense canopy, we made a desperate decision. The diary hinted at a ritual, an ancient counter-ritual that could weaken the witch's hold over the land if performed correctly. It was a risky, desperate gambit, one that required both our faith in the old legends and our willingness to confront the supernatural head-on. Despite our battered spirits, we gathered what little supplies we had, using the RV's remaining resources to piece together a makeshift altar in a clearing near the abandoned cabin. As I began to recite the incantations from the diary, Emily and I could almost feel the temperature drop further, the air thickening with a malevolent presence. The forest fell into an unnerving silence, broken only by the rhythmic murmur of our voices and the pounding of our hearts. For a brief, tense moment, it seemed as if the witch's spirit was gathering around us, her presence an oppressive weight pressing down on our very souls. Then, in a violent burst of energy, the clearing erupted into chaos. The spectral figure of the witch materialized before our eyes, her form more terrifying and vivid than ever. Dark, writhing shadows coalesced around her, and her eyes blazed with a fury that defied description. She shrieked, a sound that was both mournful and horrifying, and lunged toward us. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I pushed Emily back, my mind locked in a battle between terror and determination. The air around us crackled with supernatural energy as the witch's assault intensified. I tried to continue the ritual, my voice trembling yet resolute, while Emily clutched the diary as if it were a lifeline. The spectral attack was not merely a passive haunting. It was violent, ferocious, and unyielding. In the midst of the chaos, Aaron's condition took a fatal turn. The wounds he had sustained were too severe, and despite our frantic efforts to stabilize him, he slipped away, leaving us in a void of grief and fear. His loss was a brutal, painful reminder that this malevolent force was not just a trick of the mind, but a tangible, deadly enemy. The sight of his lifeless form only steeled my resolve. We had to end this, or we would be consumed by it. As the witch closed in, her form shifting between that of a crone and a hideous specter, Emily and I pressed on with the ritual. With each word we spoke, the air around us shimmered, as if reality itself was warping under the pressure of ancient magic. The diary's instructions were precise, yet ambiguous. A puzzle we had to solve amidst terror. Every carved symbol in the trees, every whispering echo seemed to confirm that we were tapping into a deep, primal force that the witch commanded. I could feel the energy in the clearing intensify, a crescendo of supernatural power that left my limbs trembling. The witch's shrieks mingled with the wind, and for a terrifying moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. Emily's eyes, wide with both terror and fierce determination, locked with mine, and in that silent exchange, we knew we were the only ones who could break the curse that had haunted these woods for centuries. In a final desperate surge, we recited the last lines of the ritual. The ground beneath us shuddered, and the oppressive darkness seemed to recede momentarily. The witch recoiled, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. It was as if the ancient words had stripped her of some of her power, forcing her to retreat into the shadows. But the battle was far from over. With a final guttural cry, she lunged at us one last time. I threw myself in front of Emily, feeling the icy grip of fear and the sting of spectral claws that tore at the air around me. The impact was like a collision of worlds, physical pain mingled with the raw force of otherworldly malice. I could barely stand, my body trembling with exhaustion and the shock of the encounter. Yet, in that moment, the forest itself seemed to come alive, as if offering its reluctant aid. A sudden gust of wind scattered the leaves, and the symbols carved into the nearby trees glowed faintly, their light a beacon of ancient power. I shouted for Emily to keep reciting the incantations, my voice raw with determination despite the agony coursing through me. The spectral witch faltered, her form wavering as if caught in a sudden, inexplicable storm, her furious eyes locked onto mine, and for an agonizing heartbeat I felt her malice seep into my very soul. But I refused to yield. With one final resounding declaration, Emily and I completed the ritual. The witch's scream echoed through the forest, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the night. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the oppressive presence lifted. The dark shadows receded, and the unnatural chill dissipated. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, while Emily knelt beside me, her eyes brimming with tears. Tears for Aaron, for the terror we had endured, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. In the quiet aftermath, we gathered our remaining strength to tend to the wreckage around us. The RV, our once trusted refuge, sat silent and lifeless, a stark reminder of our isolation and the frailty of our human constructs against the supernatural. We made the agonizing decision to leave the cursed clearing and attempt an escape. Every step away from that haunted spot felt like a victory over the evil that had nearly claimed our lives. As we drove away on the narrow, winding roads of the Ozark National Forest, the memory of that night was etched into my mind like a scar. The loss of Aaron, the harrowing encounter with the witch, and the raw terror of facing an ancient curse would haunt me for years to come. Yet, in that escape, there was also a glimmer of hope, an understanding that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit could muster the strength to fight back. Reflections on the curse. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my small apartment far from the forest, I still hear the echoes of that night. The diary, now filled with my own frantic annotations, serves as a grim reminder of the forces that lurk in the forgotten corners of our world. I often wonder if the witch will ever return to reclaim her dominion over the Ozarks, or if our desperate ritual merely delayed the inevitable. Emily has since left town, unable to bear the constant reminders of our shared nightmare. I carry on, a solitary figure burdened by the memories of Aaron's sacrifice and the relentless whispers of the forest. There are nights when I awaken to the sound of rustling leaves and soft, haunting chants, and I question whether the evil we encountered is truly vanquished or simply lying dormant, waiting for another chance to rise. In the end, the experience taught me that survival in the wilderness is not just a matter of battling nature's elements or human frailties. It is about confronting the darkness that resides within and around us. The Ozark National Forest, with its ancient trees and hidden secrets, remains a place of both breathtaking beauty and unspeakable horror. And while I may never return to those cursed woods, their memory is forever intertwined with my own, a constant reminder that some legends are born of truth, and that the past, with all its horrors, is never truly gone. I often find myself asking, what price did we pay for our brief taste of freedom? For me, the answer is clear. We paid with the blood of our friend, with sleepless nights and shattered peace of mind, and with the knowledge that some evils are as old as the land itself. The curse of the Ozark witch is not just a tale of supernatural terror. It is a story of survival, loss, and the unyielding struggle between the fragile human spirit and the relentless forces that lie in wait in the darkened corners of the world. My name is Jack Harper, and I am haunted by those memories every day. The lessons learned in the depths of that cursed forest have left an indelible mark on my soul, a mark that reminds me to tread carefully in the shadows, where ancient curses and restless spirits await those who dare to disturb their slumber. Even now, as I look out my window at the night sky, I sometimes catch a glimpse of movement among the trees, a subtle reminder that the darkness is never far behind. And though I strive to move forward, the echoes of that terrifying weekend continue to whisper, a grim warning that in the Ozarks, legends never truly die. My name is Caroline Matthews. I'm 34 years old, and this happened one fateful autumn when my partner Mark Evans and I decided to escape our troubled city lives for a weekend retreat in Devil's Den State Park, northern Arkansas. I had always been a rational woman, practical, resourceful, and a believer in science. But even I couldn't have predicted that the wilderness held secrets that defied all reason. We'd been together for nearly 5 years, and after a particularly exhausting period of arguments and emotional distance, Mark and I agreed that a break might help us reconnect. The plan was simple: pack our aging RV with enough supplies, leave behind the chaos of our daily routines, and immerse ourselves in the solitude of nature. I was determined that this trip would be a turning point, a healing journey if we could just make it through the first night without incident. The drive to Devil's Den was long and winding. I remember the road twisting through dense forests and steep cliffs, a constant reminder that nature held power over man-made technology. Mark, ever the adventurer with his spontaneous humor, made light of our creaking RV and unreliable GPS. "It's like riding a roller coaster built by a drunk engineer," he joked, his laugh echoing off the rocky slopes. I couldn't help but smile at his quip, even as I worried about the inevitable breakdowns that loomed ahead. Upon arriving at Devil's Den, we discovered that our RV was parked on a remote lot fringed by dark, towering pines. The area felt isolated, almost too isolated for my comfort. We met a local at a small general store in a nearby Ozark community, a wiry man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to know too much. Over a cup of bitter coffee, he warned us in a low, gravelly voice, "You folks best be careful around these parts. They say there's a curse here, an old witch's spirit, born of betrayal and bloodshed. Don't be stirring up old ghosts." I brushed off his words with a polite smile, though a seed of unease was planted deep inside me. That first evening, as twilight surrendered to night, Mark and I tried to settle into the RV. The interior was cramped, and the persistent clamor of creaking metal and malfunctioning lights did little to soothe our nerves. I busied myself checking the supplies: a few stale sandwiches, a bottle of water, and a pack of batteries that seemed to promise only limited help. Mark fiddled with the old radio, attempting to catch a station, but static was all he received. It wasn't long before the first signs of eeriness began to manifest. Around midnight, I awoke to a series of soft scratches against the RV's exterior. At first, I assumed it was a branch scraping the side as the wind picked up, but then I noticed odd symbols carved into the wood near the door, spiral patterns that seemed almost deliberate. My heart began to race. I called for Mark, who joined me by the window, his face pale in the pale light of the dashboard. "Caroline, did you see that?" he whispered, his tone laced with a mix of excitement and dread. I nodded silently, unable to tear my eyes away from the eerie marks. We decided to step outside, flashlights in hand, to inspect the area. The forest loomed before us, its darkness impenetrable except for the narrow beams of our lights. As we walked along the edge of the RV, I could hear distant murmurs, a low, unintelligible chant that seemed to come from deep within the woods. The sound was both hypnotic and deeply unsettling. Our steps faltered when we reached a clearing not far from our campsite. There, etched into the trunk of an ancient oak, were more symbols, resembling those from the RV but larger, almost ritualistic. I felt an overwhelming urge to retreat, but Mark, ever the impulsive soul, suggested we follow the markings. Maybe it's a clue or a part of some local legend, he reasoned, his eyes reflecting a wild curiosity. I hesitated, my logical mind screaming caution, but his insistence and our shared need for answers pushed me forward. That night, under a sky choked with heavy clouds, we followed the symbols into the depths of the forest. Every snap of a twig underfoot echoed like a harbinger of doom. The further we ventured, the more palpable the oppressive atmosphere became. A sudden gust of wind sent leaves swirling around us, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a shadow moving with deliberate intent among the trees. Before we could react, a scream, heart-wrenching and inhuman, ripped through the silence. We froze. Mark's hand gripped mine tightly as we exchanged terrified glances. The scream seemed to emanate from all around us, echoing off the trees and filling the air with despair. We scrambled back toward the clearing, our hearts pounding, only to find that the source of the scream had vanished, leaving behind an unsettling silence that swallowed our frantic breaths. Back at the RV, tension simmered between us. Mark's impulsivity clashed with my need for cautious analysis. We shouldn't have gone out there, I chided softly as I tried to restart the radio, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. This place, it's not what I expected. Mark's response was strained, his eyes dark with unspoken fear. Maybe we just got lucky, Caroline. It could all be explained away. But even he couldn't shake the tremor in his voice. The following day brought little respite. The RV's mechanical problems escalated, forcing us to rely on outdated maps and our own instincts to navigate the rugged terrain. Our supplies were dwindling, and our communication devices, our last link to the outside world, continued to falter. With each passing hour, the isolation of Devil's Den became more suffocating. Desperate for answers, we recalled the local warning from the general store. Mark suggested that we seek out an elder who might understand these local legends. I was reluctant at first. I prided myself on my rational approach to problems. However, faced with mounting dread and inexplicable occurrences, I agreed. We managed to locate a small Native American community not far from the park. There, an elder named Josephine greeted us with a knowing gaze, her presence both commanding and serene. In her modest home adorned with traditional symbols and artifacts, Josephine listened intently as we recounted our experiences. The strange carvings, the chanting, and the bone-chilling scream in the woods. She nodded slowly and explained, "What you have encountered is the spirit of a woman betrayed long ago, a witch of our people, cursed by the sins of those who wronged her. Over time, her anguish transformed her into a vengeful presence, one who seeks retribution on intruders who disturb her sacred lands." Her words struck a chord deep within me. For the first time, the rational part of my mind had to confront a reality steeped in ancient pain and tradition. Josephine further explained that the spirit's anger was not arbitrary. According to local lore, she'd once been part of a small band of indigenous people who were forced into cannibalistic rituals by colonizers, a dark chapter in the region's history. Her spirit is dangerous, especially when it feels disrespected or when the balance of nature is upset, she warned. It is not enough to simply run or hide. You must appease the anger within. Armed with Josephine's guidance, Mark and I prepared a protective ritual using a blend of modern improvisation and ancient rites. We gathered simple items: a few candles, some salt, and a handful of sage, while Josephine instructed us on the proper incantations. The ritual was meant to create a barrier of spiritual energy around our RV, a small sanctuary against the encroaching darkness. That night, as we set up the protective circle around our battered RV, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and every sound was amplified in the quiet. Mark's hand trembled as he helped light the candles, and I could see the fear mirrored in his eyes. We recited the incantation in unison, our voices faltering but determined, hoping to stave off the malevolence that lurked just beyond the circle of light. For a while, it seemed to work. The oppressive energy subsided, and we managed a few hours of uneasy sleep. But the respite was short-lived. Sometime past midnight, I awoke to the sound of the RV shuddering violently, as if something had struck it with tremendous force. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my ears, and saw Mark wrestling with the door, his face contorted in a mix of terror and disbelief. "Caroline, something's out there," he cried, his voice hoarse with panic. I rushed to the door and peered into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, gaunt, and shifting unnaturally, as if made of the very shadows around us. The entity moved with a predatory grace, its eyes gleaming with a feral intensity that chilled me to the bone. Before we could react, the RV was rocked by another violent impact, and our carefully arranged circle of candles flickered wildly. The entity had breached our defenses. Mark and I were forced to scramble outside, our only option to confront this supernatural force head-on. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that fleeing without understanding the nature of this malevolent spirit might seal our fate. We followed the creature into the forest, our flashlights dancing over the gnarled trunks and tangled underbrush. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. It wasn't just a physical threat anymore. It felt as though the very soul of the woods was at war with our intrusion. The entity led us to a clearing where the air was thick with the scent of decay and ancient sorrow. There, amid a ring of stone ruins, half consumed by ivy, we encountered evidence of a long-forgotten ritual. Scattered around were remnants of what appeared to be ceremonial offerings: charred bones, fragments of cloth, and crude carvings in the stone. I felt a deep sadness mixed with the dread as I realized that this site had once been sacred, only to be desecrated by the cruelty of colonizers. Suddenly, the figure reappeared, its form becoming more solid and menacing with each passing moment. It lunged at us with a ferocity that left no room for hesitation. I remember the sensation of icy pain as it struck Mark, sending him sprawling to the ground. Time slowed as I struggled to defend both of us, my hands trembling as I clutched a broken branch like a makeshift weapon. In that terrifying moment, my rational mind finally shattered under the weight of raw, unexplainable horror. The creature was not merely a specter. It was violent, predatory, and filled with an unquenchable rage born of centuries of injustice. I managed to scramble behind a large boulder, Mark groaning in pain beside me as the entity circled us like a wolf stalking its prey. My heart pounded, each beat a deafening reminder of our vulnerability. I recalled Josephine's words and fumbled through the ritual instructions in my memory. With Mark barely conscious and our options dwindling, I resolved to try the incantation again, this time with every ounce of fear and hope mingling in my voice. I could see the creature's eyes narrow, as though it sensed the shift in energy. "By the ancient ways and the spirits of the land begone, foul wraith, return to the night from whence you came," I cried, my voice trembling but resolute. For a moment, silence fell. The creature hesitated, its form wavering as if caught in the crossfire of our determination and its own malevolence. Mark, summoning what little strength he had left, echoed the words. The clearing pulsed with an otherworldly glow, and I could almost believe that our combined plea had resonated with the long-forgotten power of the land. The entity shrieked, a sound that was part agony, part rage, and recoiled into the darkness. With a final, haunting glance, it retreated, melting away into the night as if swallowed by the forest itself. I sank to my knees, relief and sorrow intermingling. Relief that we had survived, and sorrow for the tortured soul that had driven us to the brink of terror. In the aftermath, Mark and I returned to our RV, our wounds a painful reminder of the night's ordeal. We didn't know if the entity was truly gone or simply lying in wait for another chance to strike. But for that moment, we clung to the fragile hope of dawn. The experience had torn through the veneer of our modern lives, forcing us to confront the raw, untamable force of ancient history and nature's revenge. Over the following days, we worked to repair our RV and sought further guidance from Josephine, who warned us that the spirit's anger might never fully subside until the injustices of the past were acknowledged. We left Devil's Den with both physical scars and deep emotional wounds, our journey having transformed us in ways we were only beginning to understand. Mark and I spent many long hours discussing the meaning of our encounter, how it had forced us to reconcile our differences and recognize that sometimes survival demands more than just modern technology or rational thought. It requires trust in the mysteries of the past and in each other. As I write these words now, safe in a distant town far from the oppressive isolation of Devil's Den, I can still feel the weight of that night pressing against my chest. I am forever changed, haunted not only by the memory of the vengeful spirit, but by the realization that some wounds of history bleed into the present, manifesting as forces beyond our control. The experience shattered my certainty and left me with a profound respect for the ancient traditions and warnings of those who came before us. I learned that survival in the wilderness is not just a test of physical endurance or mechanical prowess. It is a trial of spirit and resolve. In facing a force born from betrayal and centuries of pain, I discovered that true strength lies in acknowledging the power of history and the need to respect it, even when it defies all modern logic. The night at Devil's Den will forever be etched in my memory as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous creatures are not born of flesh and blood, but of sorrow, rage, and the relentless pursuit of justice from beyond the veil. My name is Caroline Matthews, and I am forever marked by the darkness I encountered in those haunted woods. Even as I move forward, I carry with me the scars of that night, a reminder of the fragile boundary between our rational world and the ancient, unyielding forces that lie just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when our intrusion awakens their wrath. My name is Robert Taylor. I'm 42 years old, and this happened one rainy autumn when I left behind the chaos of my old life to seek refuge along the Buffalo National River in northern Arkansas. I was a solitary man, burdened by regrets and the weight of a tragedy I could never quite escape. My battered RV was both my sanctuary and my prison, a metal shell that carried me into isolation, away from the memories of a life I once knew. I had spent years wrestling with guilt over the accidental loss of someone I loved dearly. That grief had driven me to the edge, pushing me into seclusion, far from the familiar and the safe. I thought that by immersing myself in the raw, unspoiled beauty of nature, I might finally find a way to forgive myself and piece together the fragments of my shattered soul. The journey itself was a blur of winding roads and endless rain. I remember how the landscape shifted from the manicured suburbs I'd once known to rugged, wild terrain where the forest reclaimed the land. The Buffalo National River, with its churning currents and ancient sandstone cliffs, beckoned me with both promise and warning. There was something in the air, a faint echo of sorrow, perhaps, that I couldn't shake. Every mile took me further away from my past and deeper into a wilderness that held secrets of its own. I arrived at a secluded campsite nestled among towering oak and pine trees. The RV, though creaking and groaning under the strain of years on the road, provided me a modest shelter. The first night was uneventful at first, the sound of rain pattering on the roof, the steady hum of the engine cooling down, and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a brisk wind. But as darkness fell, I began to notice things that defied explanation. It started with a whisper, a soft, childlike voice reciting fragments of a lullaby I couldn't place. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the wind or my own tired mind playing tricks. Yet, night after night, the whispering persisted. At dusk on my first evening, as I sat by the small propane stove trying to warm my chilled hands, I heard it again. A gentle, almost mournful melody floated on the air, barely audible above the patter of rain. The sound sent a chill through me, stirring memories of innocence lost and a time when I hadn't known such pain. Over the following days, I became increasingly aware of strange markings near my campsite. In the soft mud by the edge of the clearing, I found footprints that looked too small to belong to any adult, and yet they circled my RV in a deliberate, almost ritualistic pattern. Carved into the bark of an old cedar were symbols I couldn't decipher, spirals and curves that hinted at ancient lore. I tried to rationalize these occurrences. Maybe they were made by a local animal, I thought. But the footprints and symbols felt too deliberate, too human. Desperation for answers gnawed at me. I needed to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting memories of a past I'd tried so hard to forget. In a nearby town, I found a small historical museum run by Evelyn Price, a woman in her late 50s with a compassionate gaze and a wealth of local knowledge. Over a cup of bitter coffee in her cluttered office, I recounted my experiences. The whispering lullaby, the strange footprints, and the symbols carved in the trees. Evelyn listened intently, nodding slowly as if each detail confirmed something long suspected. "What you've encountered," she said softly, "is known to us as the Echo. It's said to be the spirit of a young girl named Lily, who vanished decades ago under tragic circumstances near this river. Her restless soul, full of sorrow and longing, appears to those burdened by guilt or deep grief. In our lore, she is a symbol of loss, a ghostly reminder of the pain that we carry." Her words struck me like a sudden gust of cold wind. I had never believed in such things. I was a man of logic, a man who had hidden behind rationality for far too long. Yet, as I listened to Evelyn speak, I felt that same cold grip of despair I'd known in my darkest moments. Perhaps Lily's spirit was not simply a figment of local myth, but a reflection of the pain that had driven me to the brink. Evelyn told me more about Lily, a sweet child who had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but whispered legends and unhealed wounds. The locals believed that her spirit was drawn to those who were similarly broken, her sorrow merging with their own. I left the museum with a heavy heart and an unsettling sense that my own inner turmoil was somehow intertwined with the mysterious echo that haunted the nights. Back at my campsite, I tried to resume a semblance of normalcy. I fixed small things around the RV, replaced a few worn-out batteries, and attempted to cook a simple meal. Yet, every time the rain began to fall and the forest darkened, that gentle, plaintive voice would rise again, blending with the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. It was as if Lily's ghost was calling out to me, reaching into the depths of my soul. One particularly stormy evening, as lightning split the sky and the wind howled like a pack of wolves, I felt compelled to follow the echo. Clutching a weathered flashlight and an old journal where I had scribbled my thoughts, I ventured into the forest. The rain soaked through my clothes and blurred my vision, but the voice guided me as if it were a beacon in the darkness. I followed a narrow, muddy trail that wound its way through the dense underbrush. Every step was a battle against the elements, and the forest seemed to close in around me, oppressive and foreboding. The further I walked, the more the voice grew, sometimes a soft hum, other times a desperate plea. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination fueled by guilt and loneliness. After what felt like hours, I arrived at a small clearing by the river. The scene was surreal, a circle of smooth stones, half submerged in the shallow water, and in the center, a delicate figure hovered in the air. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would shatter the silence. There, bathed in the pale glow of the moon breaking through the storm clouds, was the spectral form of a little girl. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow that mirrored my own, and her voice, now clear as day, murmured the same lullaby I had heard for nights on end. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my RV, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. In that quiet, desperate moment, I felt an overwhelming connection, a shared sense of loss and longing that transcended the boundary between life and death. I knelt by the water's edge, my hand trembling as I reached out, half expecting to feel nothing but cold air. Instead, I felt a fleeting warmth, like the echo of a long-forgotten memory. "Lily?" I whispered, unsure if she could understand me. The figure's form shimmered and then faded, leaving me alone with the pounding rain and the relentless murmur of the river. I sank to my knees, tears mingling with the rain, as the weight of my guilt and sorrow threatened to overwhelm me. In the days that followed, I could not shake the image of that spectral child. I returned to Evelyn Price at the museum, desperate to learn more about Lily and the legend of the echo. Evelyn explained that many who encountered Lily's spirit had been those burdened with deep personal regrets, souls yearning for absolution. "Perhaps," she said gently, "her presence is a reminder that healing can only come from confronting our past, however painful it may be." I pondered her words as I resumed my solitary existence by the river. The echo persisted, sometimes as a barely perceptible whisper on the wind, other times as a vivid, almost tangible presence. Each encounter dredged up memories I had long tried to bury, the laughter, the love, and the unrelenting guilt of a mistake that had cost me dearly. I began to document these experiences in my journal, writing down every detail in an effort to understand what was happening to me. With each entry, I realized that the echo was not merely a ghost haunting the night. It was a mirror reflecting the fragments of my soul that I had left unhealed. As the nights passed, the supernatural occurrences grew bolder. On one occasion, while I was reading by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, I heard soft footsteps outside the RV. I pressed my ear to the window and listened intently. The sound was light, almost playful, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I opened the door a crack, half expecting to see no one, yet I glimpsed a fleeting shadow, small and quick, as if a child had darted past. I shut the door, my heart racing, and resolved that I could no longer ignore the presence that had intruded so deeply into my solitude. One fateful night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The rain hammered on the RV, and the wind screamed through the trees as if lamenting lost souls. In the midst of the tempest, the echo reached its crescendo. The voice, now unmistakably that of a child, filled the small space, urging me to step outside. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to seek shelter and the overwhelming need to confront the truth. Finally, I stepped out into the downpour, the cold rain mingling with the warmth of my rising emotions. I wandered toward the river, my steps uncertain and my vision blurred by the rain. There, on the bank, I saw a faint glow, a circle of light that seemed to pulse with an inner rhythm. Drawn by an inexplicable force, I approached it, my breath shallow as I neared the source. In the center of the circle was an arrangement of smooth stones, much like the formation I had seen before, but this time surrounded by small candles that flickered even in the storm. I recognized this as a makeshift altar, a ritual site likely established by someone who, like me, was seeking answers in the dark. Trembling, I sat down beside the stones, pulling my soaked jacket tighter around me. The echo of the lullaby filled the air, and I felt the spectral presence draw nearer. In that raw moment, I made a decision. I would confront my past, the guilt that had haunted me for so long, and perhaps in doing so, find the peace I so desperately needed. I opened my journal, its pages filled with the raw pain of my memories, and began to write. I wrote of the love I had lost, the mistakes I could never undo, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was possible, even if it was a forgiveness from the other side of life. As I wrote, the air around me grew warmer, and the spectral light seemed to intensify. For a fleeting moment, I saw the ghostly figure of Lily again, her eyes no longer filled with sorrow, but with a quiet understanding. It was as if she was acknowledging my confession, accepting the heavy burdens I carried. The realization hit me hard. The echo was not just a harbinger of my pain, but a call to release it, a chance to let go of the guilt that had held me captive for so long. I spoke aloud, my voice shaky but resolute. "I forgive myself," I said, the words echoing across the riverbank. "I honor your memory, Lily. I let go of the past so we both may find peace." In that moment, the world around me seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight of sorrow lifting ever so slightly. The candles on the altar flickered in unison, and the rain, which had been relentless minutes before, softened to a gentle patter. I don't know if that was the end of the echo's visit, or if it was simply a pause, a moment of clarity in a life long shrouded by regret. Over the following days, I continued to document my journey, noting that the spectral encounters became less frequent, the voices more like distant memories than haunting commands. The echo had not vanished entirely. Rather, it had receded to the background, a constant reminder of the unresolved pain that I now had the courage to face. By the time I packed up my RV to leave the Buffalo National River, I felt a profound change within me. The solitude that had once been a refuge from the world had become a mirror reflecting my inner truth. I wasn't entirely free of guilt or sorrow, but I had taken the first steps toward healing. I had confronted the echo, a ghost born of tragedy and loss, and in doing so, found a fragile sense of redemption. Driving away from that wild, haunted stretch of land, I carried with me not only the scars of my past, but also the hope of a future where the echoes of grief could be transformed into lessons of forgiveness. My journey was far from over, but I no longer ran from the shadows of my memories. Instead, I embraced them, knowing that in acknowledging the pain, I had begun the long process of healing. Now, whenever the wind whispers through the trees or the river sings its ageless song, I remember that stormy night on the riverbank. I remember the spectral glow, the soft echo of a child's lullaby, and the weight of all the things I had once believed were unchangeable. And in those moments, I smile, not because the past is forgotten, but because I have learned that even the deepest echoes of sorrow can one day lead to a quiet peace. My name is Robert Taylor, and that autumn along the Buffalo National River changed me forever. I now carry with me the bittersweet memory of a ghostly echo, a reminder that even in the depths of isolation and guilt, there's always a chance to find a little light, a little hope that guides us toward forgiveness and redemption.